Good evening all and welcome. I'd like to just thank everyone for subscribing and pressing the bell icon and keeping those notifications on. It genuinely feels like YouTube is trying to turn it off for a bunch of people, so for everyone who has returned and keeps watching, thank you. It really means the world to me. So for tonight's compilation, this particular vintage of stories is from about 1.5 to 2 years ago, so I really hope you enjoy the mix. But for now it's time to get comfortable and let the darkness take control. When I was 6, my babysitter was this nice middle-aged lady and her equally nice husband. My twin brother and I were always at their house in the summer and hung out with the couple's 2 grandkids, another boy and girl sibling set of similar ages. This was literally my happy place. This lady had the best movie collection for a 6-year-old. It's where I saw The Last Unicorn for the first time, as well as The Little Mermaid, The Great Mouse Detective, The First Land Before Time, and The Brave Little Toaster. And her husband was a phenomenal cook by a kid's standard. Every day was chicken nuggets and pizza day. They had kid-size 4-wheelers, a pool, a huge kids' playhouse, and a jungle gym set up in the backyard. And they put on the best 4th of July show in the county for years. 6-year-old me was the happiest girl on the freaking planet, and they were some of the wealthiest people in the area too. Neither of them worked, so I had no idea where their money came from, but I didn't care. One day midsummer, the 2 boys were being typical boys, and the little girl and I thought they were being mean. In reality, the boys wanted to play war or something, and the girls wanted to play weddings, or something similar. She and I were sad, and we refused to play with the boys. Instead, we decided to pick flowers that grew at the edge of the forest. We thought it was baby's breath, but it was really just poison hemlock. Seriously, kids, right? So we're walking along the edge of this dense forest in the middle of banjo country in southern Ohio. This was in 1990. So we weren't worried about stranger danger because we were just so far out into the country. The adults did worry about animals from time to time because the next county over had bears and mountain lions, but us 6-year-olds were fearless. We ended up walking on the neighbor's property, picking these flowers when we found a break in the tree line. It was an old, well-worn path leading into the woods. For whatever reason, i.e. we were dumb, she and I decided to ditch our flowers and take the path into the woods and see what it led to. The path itself was unremarkable, well-worn but unmaintained, as there were tree roots growing up through the path in places. We came upon a little bridge at one point. We were both a little confused about it, because we had been told there were no creeks in our area, yet there was a bridge. It wasn't a particularly old bridge either, but the creek bed under it was dry as a bone. Weird. We kept going because, why not, I guess? I'm not sure how far we walked beyond the bridge, but we ended up in a clearing with stones all around it in a circle. The clearing was big enough that there was a gap in the trees that allowed the sunlight in, and in the middle of the circle was a massive stone-walled well. It was big enough that there were stairs built into the dam wall in a huge spiral. My little friend was mesmerized by the well. She found a rock and tossed it in. We never heard it hit the bottom. As we were searching for more rocks to throw in, I was rooted around in the brush by the bigger stones and actually looked at the big ones. They were not normal stones. Nope. I was a smart cookie, already reading at 3rd grade level the summer before 1st grade, something that I loved to show off to anyone that would sit still for 3 seconds or more, so I could read the stupid stones. There were names and dates cut into the rough-hewn stones. We were in a graveyard, in the middle of the woods, far away from our adults. I remember getting chills realizing this. Moments later, my little friend got really quiet and poked me. She pointed to the edge of the clearing on the other side of the wall. Thankfully, not the side that we had entered the graveyard on. My little heart would have exploded, I think. She was pointing at a dark shape standing just inside the woods facing us. We both stood up very slowly and stared at this dark shape. At some point, the little girl took my hand and tried to get me to leave, but I couldn't move. The fear was paralyzing. I didn't move until the clouds covered the sun, and our bright, inviting clearing became slightly shadowy. Then, the shape moved. It was an adult-sized / shaped thing, wearing long dark robes with a hood over its face. We were stupid kids, but we weren't that stupid. We both turned tail and ran as fast as our little legs allowed. My friend was faster than me because I was a chunkier kid with a love of reading and movies and pizza, which leads to overweightness. Who would have thought it? So she made it to the bridge first. I wasn't far behind her though. I looked back after we got over the bridge, and that thing was standing at the edge of it, just standing there. I screamed, wet myself, and kept running. I tripped over a tree root in the path, ripping my pants and shredding my knee in the process. I scrambled up and kept running. We burst out the trees like our hair was on fire, screaming and crying, and made a beeline for the girl's grandparents' house. Her grandfather was in the backyard planting something and came running when he heard us. We were absolutely hysterical, and nothing could calm us down. We spent hours sobbing while the grandma and grandpa got us bathed and in clean clothes to try and soothe us. The more they said there was no one in the woods, the more hysterical we became. It took both of us months before we'd even go on the back deck again. Everyone was convinced we'd made up a story with our hyperactive imaginations, but the adults humored us. The kids, not so much. The next summer we were forced into the backyard for the annual 4th of July party. Tons of kids. They all knew our story, and one of the teenage boys, a badass, don't you know, called BS and bullied us for hours until we told him where the path in the woods was. And then, he made us go with him. Cue another incident of me pissing my pants. Yay! To my utter relief, when we got there, she and I both remembered where the path was. There was nothing. No path. Just a very heavy growth of hemlock. He tried to wade through it and ended up with chiggers from neck to foot. And he got into a ton of trouble for dragging us kids down there once we got back. So she and I were relieved not to go back there. But from then on, all those kids thought we were stone cold liars. Fast forward 15 years later, 16 years after this all happened, my mum mentioned that the grandpa passed away a few months prior while I was off school. I was 22 at that point and had mostly forgotten the events in the woods. I expressed my condolences and asked what happened. I mean, this guy was a friend of my mum's for 20 plus years. My mum started being evasive, so I got curious and pressed her, and she said that he had hung himself in their garage. Jesus, wow, okay, that sucks. And then she told me the bad part. His granddaughter, my little friend, was the one that found his body. All around him were notebooks with crazy writings he had amassed over a very long time, some dating back to the early 70s apparently, detailing his dealings with demons and spirits and other crazy things. He had left notes for all of his loved ones. The note for his granddaughter was an apology for not protecting her from the demon at the well, and the note for his wife was an apology for leaving her, as it was the only way to protect her and the other people he loved. It seems that the explanation for their wealth was deals struck with the demons. After a few decades of these deals, they had started coming to collect on the debts the man owed, and what they wanted was for him to kill his family in payment. So, he killed himself instead. It was the craziest thing I'd ever heard, but it made total sense. Everyone wrote the guy off as having a serious mental health issue, threw the journals away, buried him, and moved on. No investigation, nothing. I can rationalize everything we saw and experienced to some kind of weird psychological reaction to picking hemlock. That wouldn't explain how both of us had the exact same delusion, though. I know what I saw was real. I might not remember all the details nearly 30 years after, but I do remember the fear, and I still have that scar on my knee that has never faded. I'm not afraid of the woods nor the dark, or anything like that, but I have a very healthy respect for the dead, and don't mess with demons and stuff. In the immortal words of Ducky, nope, nope, nope. I had been living in Prague for about a year. I taught 3rd grade at a bilingual school during the day, and worked door security for a tourist bar at night. Weekends I would get off work around 3 or 4 depending on how busy it was, at which point I would take the tram from the city centre to JCP, where my apartment was located. At the time I was around 22, I had short black hair and round glasses. This is important. One night I stood at the back of the tram, my headphones in despite my phone being dead. They were like a security blanket to prevent me from socializing with drunk English speakers that populated the city centre at this time of night. This group of 7 guys, looking to be between 25 and 30, were getting loud and drunk. I'm okay with accents, and these guys were definitely British, probably there for a stag do. I ignored them until I hear this conversation. I'd screw that Harry Potter looking girl. Like she screw you, mate. Like I'd give you a choice. Raucous laughter, then high-fiving over the little rape joke. How can you even tell it's a girl? One way find out, isn't there? And more laughter. I kept staring at my Kindle and acting like I couldn't hear them or speak English, but internally I was screaming in panic. My stop was only 2 away, and I figured I'd wanted to be as close to my flat as possible when I got off. So I sit there ignoring the leering until the tram gets to my stop. I get off. I've got 3 blocks up and half a block over to get to my flat. They get off. That's fine. I live 2 blocks away from a very popular club, and quite a few bars and hotels are in that area. So I rationalized to myself, they're not following me. I had a test. A stupid thing I did to see if people were walking behind and following me. And I crossed at a weird place in the street. They crossed. I picked up my pace to be walking fast but not running. They pick up their pace, and laughter emanates from the group behind me. But I refuse to look back. I make the 3 blocks with them steadily closing the gap to me. Then I turn left and bolt, running as fast as I can, keychain with rock in palm and building keys between my thumb and pointer knuckle. I slam the door, and even though it locks automatically and doesn't have a turntable handle, I throw the deadbolt and continue running to my flat, where I also turn the deadbolt. I get to my room, which faces the street, and I curl up in the corner, shaking, as through my open window I can hear, "Where'd she go?" along with other things that I'm not going to share. After about 15 minutes, I hear them leaving. So yeah, you group of British boys, let's not meet. And for those of you wondering why I didn't have pepper spray or a weapon, those kind of things are harder to get for a foreigner. I did have a rock keychain on the end of my lanyard that I figured could do some damage, and my boyfriend got me a knife for my birthday last year. This, of course, was after the encounter, so I'm all kitted up now. When I was about 17, me and a few of my friends used to drive out to Union Cemetery in eastern Connecticut to do some late-night ghost hunting. We'd walk around and take photos, never really captured anything too amazing. If you haven't been to that part of Connecticut, the roads are very long and windy. It's deep in the middle of the woods, where there are no streetlights and houses are like a mile or two apart from each other. The road to the cemetery itself is probably about 10 to 15 miles single-lane road with just a few creepy-looking rundown houses. The drive alone is enough to creep you out enough to the point where you wouldn't want to set foot in the cemetery. So anyway, me and two of my friends were on this one trip up. We were heading down the road to the cemetery at 2 in the morning when this car comes up behind us out of nowhere and starts riding dangerously close behind me, to the point where I couldn't even see his headlights in the rearview mirror. We slow down, thinking it's a cop or something. It's hard to see and we can't make out anyone behind the wheel. They slow down and keep almost the exact distance. We sped up again. Still keeps the same distance. Didn't think much about it at this point, maybe just some asshole driver in a hurry or something. So we finally get to the cemetery. We didn't want to be seen pulling into the cemetery that late at night, so just past is a rotary with 2 other roads that cross paths. So we decide to pass the cemetery and go through the rotary to turn around and come back. As we approach it, we go around once and the car follows. We go around a second time, the car follows again. Now we're starting to freak out. The 3rd, 4th, and 5th time around, the car is still behind us. We can finally see that it's an older car, late 80s or early 90s Corolla or something, but we still can't make out the driver. I finally said screw it, pulled off at a random point in the rotary and just started driving as fast as I could. He still followed us at this point, and we're about 50 or 60 feet ahead of him, and I see him flip off his headlights. Now, remind you there are no streetlights on this road. It's pitch black. I'm doing 45 to 50 at this point and we think we lost him. When about a minute later his headlights come back on and he's right behind us again. Then his headlights go out. About 20 seconds or so and he comes back. He's 15 feet behind us. He does this about 3 or 4 times. Finally, I slam on the brakes and pretty much come to a dead stop and he's about 10 feet back from us. His headlights go on again, and this time I floor it and get up to about 60. His headlights come on again, and I see that he's pretty far away this time and for some reason think to pull into the first driveway I see. So we take a right up a very narrow driveway and we just sit and wait. No car passes. My heart's pounding like crazy and I'm getting ready to get out and start running towards the house, but nothing ever happened. No car ever passed us, and we were finally getting the nerve to pull out the driveway about 10 minutes later. And there's no sign of the mysterious driver. So we decided to not go to the cemetery that night. For context, this happened when I was 22 years old and a senior in college. I'm a female, and I was following a particular politician and was going to rallies and other events in my spare time. Me and my friends were having a ball and loved being involved. One particular rally I went to was in the city. My friends and I took a train in and enjoyed ourselves. On our way home back to our university, I noticed a guy sitting across from us that I had recognized from campus. He was pretty cute, and I remember seeing him around, as we must have had some mutual friends. I said hi to him, and to my delight he also recognized me. We spoke for a few minutes and discovered we were both at the same rally. By the end of the train ride, he asked me for my phone number, and I was thinking, wow, a cute guy and we have something in common. I gave him my number but didn't think much past that. About a week later, I received a text from him. He asked me if I'm free this weekend, and if I would be interested in meeting up and having a drink. This particular time was during a break from school, so not many people were around. For whatever reason, I had chose not to go home. In my naive mind at the time, I thought, great, I have the place all to myself. I met him at our local bar, and we have a few drinks. It was pretty quiet for a Friday, as it was break time, and after an hour or two, decided to leave. I invited him back to my place for a bottle of wine and to hang out some more. He wound up staying the night and leaving in the morning, but when I woke up for whatever reason, I had an uneasy feeling. Nothing bad had happened per se, I just didn't like how things had went. I felt like he was so serious, not laughing or smiling the entire evening, although he always had a drink in his hand. I realized he wasn't really drinking them. The entire evening, he was kind of shifty and nervous. The only way I can describe it, it was like he was on a mission and waiting for something. There were all these red flags to me. I felt bad, but I was just not interested in this guy. To my relief, he didn't text me for a good while after that, and I assumed he came to the same realization that we simply weren't a good match. That is until about 2 to 3 weeks later. He writes me a message telling me that he's been busy, but really wants to meet this weekend and catch up. This particular weekend, my older sister was having a large party for her husband's birthday at their house a few towns away. A few of my friends and I were going to be there as always, because it's a very large group of people at their parties, at least 50 to 60. Now, let me be clear. These parties were not your typical get wasted and stay up till the cops get called type of college parties. They were more of an adult party, given my sister's husband is fairly older than us. Don't get me wrong, there were plenty of drinks and drinking going on and it was quite fun, just more of an adult type barbecue with day drinking. Me and my 2 girlfriends were going to spend the night, as I was going to drive there, but obviously we would be drinking. The party started early, at about noon. Against my better judgment, I invited him to the party thinking it couldn't hurt. I gave him the address and the time. He seemed very interested and agreed to come. The day of the party was very fun, and my friends and I were having a blast. I must admit I did have a sinking feeling, and I was not looking forward to seeing the guy. Then, to my absolute and utter relief, I get a text from him saying he would be unable to make it. Finally, I could just relax and enjoy the party. About 12 a.m., everyone is getting exhausted from a full 12 hours of non-stop drink and partying, and as it's winding down, most of the guests have gone home, except for my friends and I and a few other guys, friends of my sister's husband, who were also sleeping there, and of course my sister and her husband. My sister had a guest room which was occupied, and a fully carpeted and finished basement. We had various blankets and pillows, and were all going to sleep down there on the couch, pretty much anywhere you could lay. As I'm about to go down to the basement and get ready for sleeping, the man walks through the front door. No knock, no text, no anything. Just confidently walks straight into the house. I don't know why, but my initial reaction was fear. I pretended to be happy to see him and gave him a small hug. I asked him why he was there, to which he never gave a real response. All of the lights were out and everyone was gone. I was gesturing around and hinting at him that the party was over and that he had missed it. I felt bad that he had made the effort and decided to speak with him for a few minutes before I went to bed. We talked. I told him I was going to get ready for bed and that I'm sorry he missed the party. He goes, "Yeah, that's fine. This dude is just not getting the hint to leave." I leave the room and go to change my clothes and set myself up a bed and brush my teeth. I'm just hoping that he will leave, but I don't hear any movement from the other room. When I come back to the living room to check and see if he's actually still there, he is, and he is asleep on the couch. I obviously find this strange, but just assumed it was late and that he must have been very tired. He didn't seem out of place, as there were various other people sleeping at the house as well. I went to the basement and found myself a place to sleep on the floor. About half an hour to an hour later, I'm laying on the floor, still awake, thinking about how weird it is that he showed up. It's pitch black down there. There are a few people sleeping, including my friends, when I hear someone in the dark slowly descending the stairs. I see they're holding a cell phone light to guide them. As the figure reached the bottom of the steps, I see it's him. Now, he has never been to this house. This is in a nice suburban area, it's not a frat house. And I did immediately think it was weird that he would randomly be walking through a house of a person he doesn't know. I, for one, pretended to be asleep. As I lay there frozen, I suddenly felt a tap on my shoulder. He doesn't say a word. He is over me and trying to wake me. I don't move and pretend to sleep still. I lay there in the dark silence, and am listening for his footsteps to walk away. I can tell he's holding a light over me. Then, with no warning, this man takes a step back, and with his boot on, kicks me full force in the face. I'm not talking about a little tap with his foot to wake me. No. Full force boot kicks me directly in the face. My face goes numb. I don't know what happened. I can feel the blood running down my nose. I open my eyes and look at him, and all I can remember saying is, "Why did you do that?" He just stared at me blankly and said nothing, turned around and walked back up the steps. I lay there paralyzed in fear. My heart is beating 1,000,000 times a minute. I don't know how long it was until I garnished the courage to get up, but eventually I army crawl in the dark over to my friend. Another man near her wakes up as well, and I explain what happened. We are all in a half-drunk daze and confused. I can't stay in this basement. I know he left, but I was so scared. My friends, and the other guy, offered to take me upstairs so that I could sleep in my sister's room. I go to my sister's room and lay next to her on the bed on the floor. I shut the door behind me, but unfortunately there was no lock. I don't know how, but eventually I fell asleep. At some point I wake up to my sister leaning over me. She asked what happened to my face, and why I was in her room. Right as I'm about to answer her, my friend, who had helped me the night before, comes flying in, and she tells us the guy is still there and asleep on the couch. She runs out, and I can hear her scream at him to get up and get out. I hear him arguing back and ask him where I am. My friend tells him that I've left, and he begins arguing. He says my car is still there. I have no idea how he knew which car was mine, as he had never seen it before, and that I hadn't even taken my purse. Eventually, he leaves. After that night, he wrote me a message a few days later as if nothing had happened, asking me to hang out again. I block him, and I've never heard from him again after that. I graduated only 2 months later, and thankfully never even saw him on the campus again. To this day, I have no idea why he kicked me in the face, and how he had the balls to stay after that. I've learnt my lesson about giving out my phone number to creeps. 4 years ago, I needed serious surgery to remove a tumor in my brain. The doctor said everything was going to be nice and easy, but it took me 2 years to return and finish school. The surgery went so poorly that while anesthesiologists and nurses were trying to keep me alive, the surgeon had a conference with my parents to keep them up to speed. Brain bleeding, severe swelling in the brainstem, etc. What's weird is that during this conference, my mum's cell phone rang. The caller ID showed it was coming from my cell phone. I had put my dad in charge of my cell phone in case the worst were to happen, notify my friends and my girlfriend that I had passed. Anyway, he pulls out my phone from his pocket and it's turned off with the battery removed. They wrap up the meeting with the surgeon, and then they walk to the nurse's station to thank them for looking after me. My mum's phone buzzes twice. She has a voicemail left by whoever was calling her from my phone. She listened to it and she heard my voice. "Hey Mum, it's me. I know things are weird right now, but I'm sitting here on this bench and I'm warm. I think everything's gonna be okay. Talk to you later. Say hi to Dad for me." About a month after the surgery, when I had recovered and moved back home, my mum had me listen to the voicemail, and I couldn't believe it. I turned white. I cried. When I heard my own voice, I thought maybe I had died and was being punished. I immediately opened my phone and looked through the call history. There, I saw the timestamp of an outgoing call on the date of my surgery. 20 minutes after, I was wheeled into the operating room. I don't know what in the world caused this. I have a story to tell that my mum told me a while back. It was her experience with a Ouija board, and my mum wouldn't make something like this up. The whole reason she even told me about it was because I brought up the idea of using one to contact a younger brother who passed away. Anyway, her story freaked me out enough to never use one. Back when she was in high school late one night, her and a group of her friends were cruising around on gravel roads a few miles outside of town, as I live in a small town in Iowa, and they stopped at an old abandoned barn and decided to whip out an old Ouija board one of her friends had. My mum had a really bad feeling right off the bat and said she wasn't going to do it. While everyone kept calling her a sissy and saying it wouldn't work unless everyone was there. So my mum was convinced, but only on one condition. She'd play if they didn't ask sketchy questions. Some of the guys laughed and promised not to. So they all gathered around the floor of the barn and placed their hands on the slider of the board. They asked some basic questions about it. Is there anyone here? What's your name? Things like that. But there was no response. Then a guy called Terry asked, which one of us will be the first to die? And my mum pulled her hands off the board and said, that's not funny. She was super pissed and everyone screamed at her to put her hand back on the board. As soon as she put her hand back on, the piece moved and spelled out the initials of a boy who was there. CJ. He was a twin. His twin was also present. And after that they said their goodbyes because they were all freaked out and my mum was pissed. And everyone was blaming each other for moving the piece on the board. So anyway, they all went home and basically forgot about the whole thing. Years later, that CJ was out driving on a gravel road and he ended up crashing into the ditch and lost his life. The first one out of everyone there. And the creepy thing is that when the police were done investigating the crash, they said the tire flew off because someone purposely loosened the lug nuts on the tire. So, ever since she told me that story, I've been too scared of trying the board. When I was a child, I used to have the strangest dreams. I would find myself in a sun-drenched field playing ball with a 6-year-old African girl, her hair in twists, clad in a red and white checked gingham romper. Eventually, her dad, an enormous dusty farmer equipped with a pitchfork and leading a horse, would call her home. She would wave goodbye and I would seize awake. I had this dream several times, each time similar, with the difference being the game we played. Perhaps ball, maybe other times hunting for insects, or simply lazing around on the grass. I knew her name was Sarah. I knew her family worked on the land. Somehow, I knew the land. Then one night I had a lucid dream. I was in my bed asleep, and thought it was the middle of the night. Light streamed in though as if it were noon, and Sarah was by my bed, tugging my nightgown sleeve. She pleaded with me to get up, to play with her. So I sluggishly rose from my bed and followed her out my room and to the foot of the stairs leading to the spooky 3rd floor. I was suddenly leadened with dread, a feeling akin to seeing that particular look in my mother's eye before she told me my great-grandmother had died. Sarah whirled around, eyes inquisitive, her playful demands to come upstairs to play, honed by something sinister. Her father appeared at the top of the stairs, horse and all I could think of, this is ridiculous. How could a horse go up all those stairs? I told her I could not and would not come up and play, and she looked so sad at me. The saddest, oldest sad I'd ever seen. I woke up that morning asleep again at the foot of the stairs, with the deepest sadness I had ever felt. I never had the dream again. However, shortly thereafter the gardeners unearthed an old hitching post in the backyard. Many years later, I went for a hike across my street in search of an apocryphal graveyard the oldest freed black cemetery in the north. I waded through the smallish swamp in my neighbor's yard and trudged up the hill to the area I had seen marked on an ancient map. There was the cemetery, invisible from the road with 15 or so headstones. While many were impossible to read and others fallen and broken, one stood out. Its memorial tree had grown around it, encasing the stone in the tree, shielding it from the elements. The body beneath was named Sarah. She had died at the age of 7 and had inhabited whatever structure existed where my house now stands. Back in the early to mid-80s, I had a paper route in a medium-sized southwestern Pennsylvania town. This would have happened around 83 to 84, so I must have been around 13 or so, depending on the year. I was out one night collecting the subscription fees from my customers. It was winter because I remember the sky was dark, and I don't remember there being snow on the ground, but I was usually done collecting by 6:30. That was on purpose, because the penguins usually came on around 7. It was cold, and I had decided that I wanted a hot chocolate for the walk home. There was a convenience store near my paper route. Even now at night, the area is fairly busy, with cross-town traffic for a dead-end southwestern Pennsylvania town. Well, I head on over into the store and got myself a nice cup of hot chocolate. I paid. As I was walking out of the lot, a dude in a pickup truck with a cap over the bed called me over. I figured for some reason that he recognized my paperboy receipt book and thought that I may know the area. 13-year-old logic, I guess. I supposed he may have been asking for directions. There was some traffic, and the lot was well lit, so I didn't feel any fear. I head over to the truck, and there were 3 occupants. A guy much older than me, but not as old as my dad, and 2 cute girls who I recognized as older than me, but I didn't know how much. The dude looked straight at me and said, "These girls want a party. Get in." Direct quote that I'll never forget. Now I'm 13 or so, pimply as hell, and weighed about 90 pounds, soaking wet, with 20 pounds of sand in my pocket. These 2 chicks want to party with me? Sure, I'm a horny 13-year-old, but I'd seen a lot of videos in school. This stuff was screaming stranger danger. I politely declined and started walking towards my house. The dude sweetens the deal. "Hey, she thinks you're really cute, and we have weed and beer. Just get in and let's go." I again declined politely. This whole time the girls have said nothing. I started walking up the road towards my house, and the dude pulled out of the lot and began following me in the truck. A couple of 100 feet up the road, a rail bridge with a retaining wall crossed over the road they were on, and on the other side I could go through a very small wooded area into my neighborhood. I went up the embankment and started crossing the tracks. I could see down onto the road, and the dude was leaning out of his truck and looking back at me. Well, I kept walking, and I saw him pass the first turn into my neighborhood. Good. I was home free. My house was 3 blocks up from the bottom of the hill, and I ran like my life depended on it, when it very well may have done. I got to the 3rd block, and what comes over the crest of the hill? A pickup. It wasn't moving very fast or anything, so I easily made it to the front porch of the duplex before it passed. I told my dad about it a few days later, and he freaked. For a month he insisted on driving me along my paper route until I was done. The first time a guy in the car pulled up alongside me, he asked if he could buy an extra paper from me. My dad pulled up and yelled at him to move along. Fortunately, I never saw the truck again. A couple of years back, some friends and I decided to take a couple of weeks off and go on a road trip. Our goal was to drive through the states from the southeast up to Pennsylvania and back. We would drive through the night and pitch our tents before dusk, sleep a little and spend the day checking out the area we stopped in. Sometimes it would be out in the middle of nowhere, sometimes near a city. It was interesting to do things that way. We were driving through Alabama when we made our stop. The thing about Alabama is the interstate through it is incredibly boring, pretty much straight and a lot of trees. We knew this in advance, so we charted a path through that would make us drive through the more rural areas. We got about 3/4 of the way through, from south to north, when we decided to stop for the morning. We found a large patch of field that didn't have a no trespassing sign visible and set up camp. Since we took turns driving, the rest of us took naps in the car. When we stopped to camp, it was mostly to rest the car. It was mostly to be able to take a nap without being cramped together or have someone else drool on you. It was about noon when everyone was ready to pack up and explore. The spot we camped in was a beautiful short grass field about 500 or so feet from where we chilled was a barn. It looked new and was really picturesque. We packed everything back into the car and decided to hoof it over to the barn and check it out. Everyone took off in different directions when we got to look around. I happened to be on the side. I was poking around the tall grass that had started to conceal some equipment when I heard one of my friends yelling. I walked into the barn and the others had already joined my loud friend. They were standing around what looked to be a trapdoor on the floor near the back of the barn. My friend tells me she heard crying, and when she found the trapdoor it stopped. We all stood there for a minute in silence listening. All we heard was the wind blowing through the barn. I look up and start to say something when out of nowhere there's a large crash. It sounded like something slammed up against the other side of the trapdoor. Everyone booked it without a second glance except me. I couldn't move, my legs didn't work. I just stood there staring at the door in wide-eyed terror. My brain was screaming for me to run, begging my legs to move, and I couldn't. Then, like a rubber band snapping into place, my body spun 180 degrees in the opposite direction. After what felt like an eternity, my legs decided to act. Just as I felt my legs start to push off, the world went black. Pitch black. It looked like and felt like someone threw a heavy blanket over me. Then the screaming started. It sounded like a young child was screaming at the top of their lungs. It never stopped. There was no pause for breath. I think I screamed. I say I think because I couldn't hear myself screaming over the child's scream. I felt something icy cold in my chest and started having trouble breathing. It felt like something grabbed my heart. Primal survival instincts kicked in, and I began to thrash my arms around, hoping to hit something, anything that would make it stop. It didn't help. I gathered as much strength left and forced myself to run. I didn't know where I was, and it didn't matter. I just had to run. And I did. Full speed straight into a low-hanging beam. I was down and out. I don't know how long, though. I remember waking up in the grass near my car. My left eye was sealed shut from dried blood. Everyone was sitting next to the car not talking. When they noticed I woke up, they helped me get cleaned up. I used a bottle of water to clean the blood off my face and bandages from the first aid kit to cover the huge gash in my forehead. I asked what happened, and they told me that they had made it to the car when they realized I wasn't with them. Of course, since it was my car, I had the keys, so they were looking out. That's when they heard me screaming. They actually told me they were thinking of running to town to get the police instead of going back for me. I never asked them why they decided to come back for me. I'm just glad they did. They told me when they found me, I was lying on the floor bleeding. The trap door was wide open, and they actually dragged me across the floor by my feet because no one would come around the other side of me and have their back to the door. Here's the kicker. After the explanation of all of this, one of them tells me to turn around and check out the barn. I look behind me, and the beautiful barn that we saw and went to investigate was now decrepit and old. I looked back at my friends and they stared back at me with blank expressions without saying anything else. I hand my keys to one of my friends and drive off. We didn't camp out like that again for the rest of the trip. We found campgrounds to stay at or just slept in the car. None of us have ever mentioned the incident since. Back when I was in college about 7 years ago, I had to move from an apartment to another last minute because, well, I was a lazy college student and hadn't made any plans. My parents were in town, so we were looking for something quick. Fortunately, we found something pretty cheap and somewhat nice right in front of the university. They were thrilled. I was just happy this was all over. So I moved in this kind of 4-room basement, which was already furnished. They said the last tenant cancelled last minute, and I only needed it for the 3 months of the summer, so he was giving us a great deal. The first room was the main room, which consisted of a living room and a little table to eat. Immediately on the right of it was the kitchen and the bathroom. The bathroom was on the left, and there was some kind of weird and small hall/connection joining it to the living room. Since the start, I always kind of felt uneasy about that bedroom for some reason, and preferred to sleep in the living room since there was already a comfy sofa bed in there, and there were no windows in the bedroom. Throughout the semester, I felt countless times that someone was watching me from the bedroom when I was alone, either watching TV or playing video games. It was weird, and every feeling to the point where I preferred closing the doors leading to the bedroom altogether. I wasn't home that much, and sometimes I slept at friends', but every time I came back it felt like I wasn't alone in that apartment. There was never any sound or sights, just a strange feeling. I spoke of it to my friends and they laughed, since I was never the superstitious kind. So I kind of brushed it off the whole time, and thought nothing of it when I finished the semester. I kind of just moved on with life. About 2 years ago, one of my friends from college texted me, "Hey, is 17 the door number you lived at in that creepy basement back at uni?" "Yeah, why?" He then sent me a picture of an old local newspaper page. He had been looking through them at the library, looking for a picture of him back in his college football days. It was the obituary section from 2009. The picture of a young and good-looking female student. Next to her picture was the picture of a door and a dress which I recognized very well. Turns out, she hung herself in her bedroom closet. I work on an adult oncology unit, where unfortunately we have a lot of comfort care patients. The majority of them transition to hospice, where they live out their final days. Sometimes they don't quite make it and pass away while they're still in the hospital. We have the most deaths in the hospital in our unit, and a lot of floats don't like coming up to our floor because everyone dies. We all love it though, and wouldn't have it any other way. There's so much love between the nurses and our patients. We get to know them really well. When people pass away, we have noticed that, unsurprisingly, it comes in threes. We will go a few weeks with no one passing away. Everyone successfully makes it out of there and goes home or to a hospice or a TCU or wherever they're going to pass on, only to have a week or two where we will have 3 to 6 deaths a week. One week we had 2 patients pass away in one night. One of the patients was in room 8. She was really near and dear to our hearts, and it was a rough time for everyone involved. She had been on the floor for a prolonged period of time, and we all watched her go from a spry old lady to basically wasting away in all aspects. She passed on nights, and by the next day there was a new patient in her room. It's hard on all of us, but as we all know, patients come and go, and we have to move on. I was doing the admission with the new patient and going over room orientation stuff. I explained that she had a one-stop shop remote which controlled the lights, TV, radio, and had the cool light. Right as I finished explaining to her that the TV buttons are right here, I set the remote down on her bed and instantly the TV turned on by itself. It began flipping through each channel at an alarming rate, faster than if you were to hold down the channel up button. She was a little older and thankfully not too observant, and I thought I was doing it, but no one was touching the remote. She says, "No thank you, I don't want to watch TV right now." So I reached down and tried to turn it off. It didn't switch off, I ended up panicking a bit inside and yanking the remote out the wall and telling her that it seemed not to be working properly and that I would get her a new one. The TV still wouldn't turn off after I unplugged the remote from the wall, and normally it would be all connected and not work if it wasn't plugged in properly. I ended up having to walk and manually shut the TV off. I headed out of there, telling her I'd be right back, and as I went to the nurse's desk to grab another one, I ran into another nurse. She was grabbing another remote, which was odd. We just got a new shipment in, and they were all normally working properly. We rarely had to replace them anymore, and I asked her if her remote was broken too, and she said that hers was acting up. I asked her which room she was in, and it was another room that a patient had passed in the night before also. The TV remotes were uncharacteristically acting up from across the wing at the same time, in the same rooms that people had died the night before. Freaky. I could ramble forever, but most stories are related to the TV. I had another situation similar to the one I just described, where the volume was going up and down by itself in a room where a patient had passed on recently. I've seen lights not work and then work again. I have even seen a sink turn on when there was no one else around. We have several designated rooms that are reserved for our comfort patients, and even when they are unoccupied, we will walk by them and it feels like someone is there. But when we look, it's clearly empty. We've had a room where IV pumps stopped working and BP machines quit on us, and nothing seems to work. But that room got cleansed by a healing touch volunteer, which I know sounds crazy, but now everything in the room works just fine. But that's a story for another day. I've never been a huge believer in the supernatural, but after working in this unit for the past year, it's not hard to believe in the paranormal. We all just embrace it because what can you do really? I had a teacher who had a very interesting Ouija board story. This teacher joked around and wasn't really ever serious, but was funny as hell and an overall good teacher. But when Ouija boards came up, she got extremely serious and shared a bone-chilling story. She had some friends over one weekend and they got bored and decided to break out the good old household Ouija board. They had asked questions and got weird vibes from some of the answers that they received, but pushed forward. Finally, someone asked when they were going to die, and it went around the circle and everyone got a decent number in their 80s or 70s. But one girl got the age 19. Granted, they were juniors/seniors in high school, so that was only a few years away. A few years go by, and the girl who got 19 as the age of death was killed by a car while walking on a beach, while on spring break. Her friend she was with broke her leg or something. She was 19, just a week away from turning 20. The nature of the death and the fact that she was close to her 20th birthday makes it so scary because she was so close to defying the Ouija board. Never ever doing it. Needless to say, I'm too terrified to get answers like that. In March of this year, I became employed by a funeral home in my area as a student and funeral director's assistant. To paint the mental image, the funeral home is small and sits in the middle of a graveyard dating back to 1803. However, most of the graves there are not that old, and we still have plenty of space for future burials. The funeral home is cozy and inviting. It has a lot of natural light and is not creepy looking in the slightest. That being said, everyone who works there tells the same story. When alone in the funeral home, whether it be day or night, the sound of some unseen person walking around can be heard. I had not been told any strange happenings until I had an experience of my own and asked others about it the next day. I had been at the funeral home at around 2 a.m, preparing paperwork to go remove a descendant from the place of death and take them into our care, when I began hearing some weird noises coming from the common area. but at first brushed it off as the AC kicking on. However, the longer I was doing paperwork, the more distinctly it sounded like someone walking around. I knew that I had disarmed the alarm myself while coming in, so I didn't really think anyone was there with me. But just to be sure, I got up, turned on my phone flashlight, and walked back there to make sure I was alone. Of course, I found nothing, but I thought it was really weird. Today I stayed later to work on a project for school that needed some of the funeral's home's materials for it. It was around 4 p.m. I was packing up a few things in the office when I began to hear the walking again. I've heard it a few times by now, and after talking about it with other people who worked there, I'm getting used to it. I was never really scared. It was just unusual or odd. But today was different. After hearing the walking for a minute or two, I began to feel watched, like something was in the office with me, looking at me. I don't know if I was just more easily affected today, or if it's becoming aware that I can hear it. This happened to me 10 years ago. I was riding a bicycle from one city through a lane. It was 10 p.m., and this was after hanging out with friends. Before I was leaving, they told me for lols, "Hey, better not go through the lane. There might be guys in a van waiting for you," and then talking about you inside the van. You see, the teachers in the first few grades of elementary school always told us not to go into cars or vans of strangers, and then they might take us and beat the crap out of us, and I'm like, don't worry, see ya. So I'm riding home through a one-way lane, when suddenly I see a van going against me. I thought it was some random car, because it didn't have their lights on and it was really dark. Then a man suddenly turns the lights on in the car and it slows down. I pass through, and 5 seconds later they shout at me, "Hey you!" I turn back to see a van with doors open and two 40-year-old guys. I stopped and asked, "What?" One of the guys just shouted, "Come over here. Why don't you come?" I was thinking about what the teachers always told us, and I jumped on my bike and continued cycling as fast as I could, pulling the lame, "I don't have time." "You don't have time?" he responds. "I'll get in the van, turn around, and I'll bet you will." I'm like, that's it, they're coming for me. I was 2 miles away from where I lived, as I lived in quite a small village. In a few streets there were no lights, and I turned around while riding as fast as possible and see they rotated the van, but it still wasn't moving. The fact that I hadn't ridden a bicycle in 4 years due to physical injury was quite disconcerting, but I rode as hard as I possibly could, faster than I ever have before, and I turned back every 5 seconds to see if they were coming for me. Fortunately, they stayed stationary on the road, but I didn't stop pedaling until I made it home. I'm not sure if they were some criminals or angry people being stuck on a forgotten road in the middle of nowhere, but for a 15-year-old kid, what the hell could I have done to help them? This next story is one of my personal favorites to share, since everything turned out alright, but I still get chills thinking about how many different ways the night could have gone wrong. Allow me to elaborate. A few years ago, my friend Jane and I took a trip to Portland, Oregon. We're both from the south side of Chicago, and Jane was feeling pretty jaded with the city. She was convinced everything was better on the West Coast, including the people. So we flew out to Portland and rented a car, which we called Veronica. The day before we were supposed to fly back home, we took Veronica and drove up to Aberdeen, Washington, to see Kurt Cobain's childhood home. After that, we drove down the coast, sightseeing along the way. We visited Astoria, Oregon to see the house from the Goonies, and ended the day at Cannon Beach to check out Haystack Rock. All in all, it was a pretty nice day. Once it started to get dark, we decided to head back to our hotel, which is just under 2 hours away. I knew that I needed gas, so I told Jane I would stop at the first gas station I saw. Cannon Beach is a small resort-type town. There are a lot of little shops and restaurants, but I didn't see any gas stations. Being from the city, I'm used to seeing 2 on every corner, so I wasn't really worried. I expected to find one soon. I am completely unfamiliar with the area, so I just keep following the GPS's instructions while talking to Jane. Next thing I know, we're not in any type of town. We're on a dark, winding road surrounded by trees. At this point, I'm getting a little worried. I pull over to the side of the road and use the GPS to search for the nearest gas station. It tells me there's one about a mile down the road. Awesome. I'll get some gas and we'll be set. So I'm driving, and Veronica tells us that we arrived at our destination. I pull into a completely dark and empty gas station. We're still surrounded by woods and darkness, and as far as I can tell, there's nothing around for miles. According to Veronica, we have about 10 miles worth of gas, and the nearest gas station from here is 30 miles away. Jane and I are sitting there trying to figure out what to do, when another car pulls in. I keep going about my business and don't really pay attention to the other car. I just assume they need gas too. When out of the corner of my eye, I see someone gesturing to me. After some hesitation, I crack the window to see what they want. There's a middle-aged man and his wife in the car. He starts asking us all kinds of questions. Need to fill up? Coming from the beach? Driving back to Portland? I keep my answers polite but short. Then he tells me he actually owns the gas station we were at, but that it doesn't make enough money to keep it open that late. He tells us he knows of a Chevron about 3 miles away and gives us directions for it. He gave us his number and says to give him a call in case we don't make it to Chevron. His name was apparently Sam the mechanic, and wanted to know if we needed him to rescue us. We thanked him profusely and headed out. Jane is going on about how nice it was, and that would never happen in Chicago. I agreed, it was very nice, and says, "A lot of weirdos out here tonight." Jane and I look at each other, and let out a small laugh. Ha, told you. I turn back to the kid and ask him what he means. He tells me this story how his brother owes some drug dealer a ton of money, and how he's hiding somewhere nearby. He's planning on kicking the crap out of him once he gets off his shift. I can tell Jane is getting uncomfortable with the building weirdness of the night, so I give the kid a decent tip, wish him luck, and start driving again. At one point during our conversation, Jane calls Sam the mechanic man and leaves him a voicemail. She tells him we made it to the gas station and how much we appreciate his help. I thought the call was unnecessary, but it is what it is. A few minutes later, we're on the highway, and about 10 minutes from our hotel, Jane's phone rings. It's Sam. Again, she thanks him profusely. He asks her where from and when we're flying home. He tells her his name is Sam Glesty, and he wrote a book called Wrongly Accused, and that we should read it while on our plane ride home. This piqued my interest. Jane? You have to look the book up to see what it's about. She Googles it, and then she makes a face that looks like she's about to puke. What is it? He was accused of being the Green River Killer. Immediately, she starts freaking out, because he now has her number. Back at the hotel, we do more digging. Apparently, a victim of the Green River serial killer picked Sam out of a lineup. However, the real killer was caught and convicted based on DNA evidence, but around the same time in the 70s, Sam was convicted and served time for abducting and assaulting a young woman in the area we were in. The book he wrote was all about that. We ended up stuck in Portland for 2 more days due to a snowstorm in Chicago. It was a weird, tension-filled 2 days. Considering the circumstances and weirdness of the night, things could have gone horribly wrong. I'm glad all I got out of that night was a story of a near miss. I grew up in a house that had a few spirits in it. My family are all skeptics and would find some way to explain things away. A few experiences, and then I'll get onto the main story. 1. Our house was 3 stories with technically 3 master bedrooms, 1 on each floor. The one on the main floor we used as an office. I would constantly hear someone walking around in the office at night, sinks turning on, toilets flushing, and occasionally talking. My parents would always say that someone was awake and making these noises, and the toilet and water running were just faulty pipes. 2. There would be a shadow figure that would pace on the top floor. There was a balcony that overlooked the foyer, and I would usually see who I presumed was a lady in a dress pacing. My parents just said it was a shadow of someone outside, as we are on a hill overlooking all our neighbors. I personally don't understand how this would be possible. 3. I hated using the upstairs bathroom, which was my bathroom. I would hear talking and singing from the bathroom. When no one was home, and I was there, I would occasionally hear bangs on the door. One time I was showering and listening to music, and I heard the bang very loudly, so loudly it shook the room. Then, the locked door swung open, and finally I heard a scream. My parents said my brother was pranking me, which is something he never did. But let's get on to the main event. My brother is about 10 years older than me. He was the only sibling living at the house with me and my parents. He had the master bedroom in the basement. I was never really in the basement except for maybe going into the garage because it was in the basement next to his bedroom. I always remember feeling uneasy down there, but I wanted a big room. So when my brother moved out, I begged my parents to let me have his room, and eventually they caved and let me have it. I moved all of my things downstairs, painted and everything, and I loved my new room. I was talking to my brother about it one day, and he told me, "Watch out for the little girl who lives down there. She likes to laugh." I was shocked, and obviously he was just kidding. My whole family besides me never talked about stuff like that. I just laughed and shrugged it off. He was probably trying to scare me. About a week after I moved into my new room, I had a friend come over, and we were just laying on the floor next to the bathroom, laughing, when she had to go to the bathroom. She closed the door, and I was just zoning out when all of a sudden she goes, "Hey, that's not funny." I asked her what she meant. I didn't do anything. She said she heard someone laughing right outside the door, but I didn't do anything or hear anything either. She left freaked out, and assumed my brother put her up to it, since she liked my brother. A few days later, I hear someone in my bedroom while I'm in the shower. I call out thinking it's my mum, but I didn't hear anything. I get out, and as I'm putting my robe on, I hear a little girl giggle and then, "Are you looking for me?" I freak out, throw open the door to the room, but no one is there. I checked the garage and ended up setting off the house alarm, so no one could have come or gone through those doors without everyone knowing. I ran upstairs and my mum is pissed that I set off the alarm, but then I tell her what happened. She told me my brother had a very similar story when we first moved in, but it was nothing. So I called my brother and asked him why he told me to watch out for the little girl. He said I was the little girl. He was kidding because you would always come downstairs and giggle really creepy. I never did anything like that. I told him that, and he got a little creeped out. I will still occasionally hear the girl. I never saw her, but she did like to laugh and open the bathroom door and closet. I called her Sarah. My brother called me up today and asked me about this. He asked me if I was sure I never tried to scare him by laughing and told him no. He became uncomfortable. I don't think he knows how to handle the fact that our house was mildly haunted. I work as an elderly care worker down in the southwest of Australia. I love my job and love all my residents who I look after and gain real cool friendships with. Sometime in early 2018, one of my favorite residents was put on palliative care, end-of-life care, which we look after more intensely, making sure they're the most comfortable they can be before they pass. I was able to spend a good amount of time of my shift being able to care for her in her final moments. As my shift ended, I got to say a last goodbye before I clocked off and went home to sleep. That night I had a dream where I was with my friends at the beach, and we were running down the stairs to head to the water, where I turned my head to the left and find the resident who I looked after sitting there staring at the ocean with just a blank look on her face. I walk up in front of her and greet her, asking if she was feeling okay. I remembered in my dream that she was meant to be in strict palliative care, to which she replied, No, I don't think I am." I kinda nodded to her and hoped that she'd feel better real soon, while I kind of wanted to wake up at that point. But the freaky part was when I woke up into another dream where I was lying on my stomach in my room, in my bed, where I was experiencing a sleep paralysis, and I hear behind me, you guessed it, a little old lady's voice telling me, "Victoria is dead, right? You know she was hurt, right?" Shortly after hearing that, I feel 2 hands push on my body as if they were trying to push me out of bed, at which point I woke up in the early morning around 4 a.m, heavy breathing and just straight up quite shaken. After going back to sleep and waking up in the morning and heading to work, I found out that the little old lady had passed away at the same time I woke up from my sleep paralysis. I've told this story to a few friends to freak them out, but I've never actually looked up details on this sort of thing happening. Call it paranormal or coincidence. I'm still not quite sure. I've gone back and forth with the idea of sharing this for a while. After searching through a lot of places on the internet, this seems like the best place to discuss them. I still have my reservations though. In any case, I am looking for answers. Several years ago I was doing my undergraduate studies at a large university in Pennsylvania. This event happened in 2005. I was dating a girl called Erin at the time who was big into New Age ideas, paganism, magic, and the like. And I did learn some cool stuff from her too. Eventually I met some of her like-minded friends, and in our conversations it came up that one of the rooms in the oldest building on campus caused 2 of them, a guy and a girl who were dating, to experience a lot of psychic distress. Kyle had gotten nosebleeds in the classroom, and Julie often grew disoriented or frightened when she was there. Someone in our group had the bright idea to sneak up there one night. And of course, we all went for it. It was me, Kyle, Julie, Erin, and a medium named Audra and her friend Sharon, and another girl called Kesha. Sharon and Kesha, like me, had a lot of supernatural experiences in the past, but didn't consider themselves mediums or sensitive or anything. So one night we bought a novelty Ouija board from Walmart, a glow-in-the-dark one because why not, and started doing our thing. At first the planchette didn't do anything, but then it started twitching and eventually it was whipping around choosing letters that made no sense to any of us. Until afterwards, as Kyle was writing down the letters. Then out of nowhere, Audra started mini convulsions. I don't know how else to describe it. Her eyes rolled up and she started spasming and making these horrific pig noises. Not just snorting or squealing, but belting those noises out like I never thought a human would be able to make. She started crawling her way to the door. The planchette was going crazy, and when Kyle jumped to her to keep her from heading towards the stairs which were directly across the hall, we all kind of snapped out of it. Audra was a small, slim girl, but it took 3 or 4 of us to keep her from leaving the room, and all the while there was still horrible noises coming from her, and we all had this incredible sense of danger and foreboding. There wasn't a terrible smell or anything like you read sometimes, but it was terrifying. Not to be anticlimactic, but after that we packed everything up, went back to my apartment, over a crappy pizza shop, and stayed huddled together for quite a while. I swear I threw the Ouija board out, but years later I would find it under my bed at a parent's house, when I was packing up to move. Seriously, any thoughts or experiences similar, or general comments would be great. When I was about 15 years old, I was a very curious teenager. I had only heard stories of the Ouija board, but had never actually tried it. So one weekend, my best friend slept over, and we decided to take our chances. My mum was super against me buying one, and she would have killed me if I brought one into her house. So my best friend and I took a big poster board and made our own Ouija board. We lighted candles, turned off the lights, and at about 1 a.m., we tried it. Everyone in the house was asleep. When we started, it was slow, but the planchette started moving all across the board. I was convinced my best friend was the one moving the piece around, but she denied it, and I trusted her to not lie. We asked for a name, and they gave us Charlie. We asked their age, and they said 10, and we asked how they died, and they just said sick. After a bunch of other questions and scared skeptics, we asked how they could prove they were real, and who they said they were, and they responded with cemetery. I don't fully remember all the questions, but I know that it led to Charlie giving us some details. It was by a path and tree, small, around the year 1820. My mum's house is literally right across the street from the cemetery. I could look out the window and see directly into it. So we were very, very close. It is an extremely old historical colonial cemetery, dating back to 1690. The next day, my best friend and I went over to the burial ground and started our wild goose chase for Charlie's headstone. Lo and behold, we found it, exactly as he described. His headstone was a cylinder shape. The name Charlie was listed, born 1810, died 1820. Behind the stone was a huge tree right next to a pathway. I could not believe the Ouija board actually worked. After discovering Charlie's grave, my best friend and I would visit him every day after school. We would just hang out there sometimes when we were bored. Sometimes, we would just sit next to him, smoke cigarettes and talk. Maybe Charlie was just lonely and wanted some friends. So, that's what we tried to give him. I was probably around 10 or so, and I think this happened in 91. I lived in a rural area, and my elementary school was on the street over, and I rode my bike there and sometimes played. One day when I was riding home, I noticed a white van, similar to a 1990 Ford E150 cargo van, had matched speed with me. I'm a kid on a bike. I'm not going near the speed limit, so I know something's weird. I try to think of a plan of what to do because I'm in trouble. So I start pedaling as fast as I can and the van speeds up to me. Luckily, I'm at the end of a street and turn left, cross a bridge, left again, and one of my friends lived on the first house of that street. His dad was home with the garage open, so that was good. I remember his dad wondering what was up. He seemed concerned but didn't ask. Just said that my friend wasn't home, as I briefly look over my shoulder and see the van continue past me. I went inside to use the restroom, but really I just needed to relax. The whole event from noticing the van pulling up was probably 2 minutes or less. I didn't get a good look at the driver at all, and that's the part that bothers me in hindsight. I think I didn't want the driver to know I noticed him or he may react. I didn't tell my parents either, or they probably wouldn't let me ride my bike out. But it ended up that I didn't feel safe riding my bike anyway. There were no reports of child abductions that I heard about, so hopefully it was just a misunderstanding. Or did I avoid a grim fate, and the driver was too scared to try again? I was driving my car alone a few years back, when I heard a loud voice, other than my own, in my head say, "Stop the car now." I was going 60 on the highway, but I checked my mirrors and saw that I was free to slam on my brakes. As I did, 2 cars with no headlights on came careening down the road on either side of me, going 100 plus. They then met in the middle and crashed into each other a few car lengths in front of me. If I hadn't have slowed down to almost stop, I would have certainly been a part of the mess. By the looks of it, they were racing or messing with one another, and they had no headlights on in the dark of night. They were in both lanes on either side of me, and then egged on each other a second or 2 more in front of me before they both decided to swerve in the center lane in front of me, maybe trying to fake each other out at the same time, I'm not sure. They were both sent into ditches on either side of me. I did not stop, but I saw many people in front of and behind me pull over. The adrenaline was really something. Their behavior had really freaked me out as well, so I just kept driving home. I'm sorry if that wasn't the right thing to do, but I know others did stop. When I was a 12-year-old kid, and after my parents' divorce, my dad was having a pretty rough time financially. We moved around a lot, and for a little while him, my brother and I were staying in this unfinished old basement apartment. The layout of the apartment was a little weird. It was like a large U shape. I had my own room at one end, which was connected to the living room, where you would enter the apartment. My dad and brother, 3 years younger than I am, shared a room in the middle that you have to go through to get to the unfinished kitchen/laundry room area on the other end. From the moment we first started staying there, I was afraid to go into my room. When I went in there, even for a moment, I felt like I was being watched. It was this very heavy, anxious feeling that only existed in that room in the house. I think I slept in there once or twice before I started asking my dad if I could just sleep in the living room instead, usually on the couch. Sometimes he would bring my bed mattress out there for me instead, as I just couldn't go into that room, not even during the day. I don't remember when it started, but one night I was sleeping on the couch, and I woke up to the sound of chains scraping on the concrete floor of the kitchen. It was loud, and it sounded like it was getting closer to me. I was just frozen and didn't move. Eventually, I saw a dark figure with sharp nails and bright red eyes slowly shuffle from the kitchen into my dad and brother's room and stand at the foot of their bed between the 2 doorways. I stood there for a bit, and then it turned to face me. I remember the eyes so vividly to this day, as I'm 30 now, and the heavy chains that hung from its clothing and dragged on the floor. He stood there for a while before shuffling out towards me in the living room, and then going into my bedroom through the open door. I remember seeing this figure a lot when I stayed there with my dad, and apparently at one point I asked my mum if I had to keep going there because I was afraid, but I don't remember that. I felt bad if that did happen though, because my dad would have no idea why I didn't want to go anymore. Still to this day I've only told 2 other people about it. An ex who just made fun of me because he was a dickhead, and my current boyfriend who doesn't believe in ghosts himself, but was willing to at least consider/talk about my experience. I'm afraid even now that if I asked my dad or my brother if they ever saw anything strange in that house, they might say yes. It did stand at the foot of their bed, after all, and if they saw it too, then it definitely was real, which honestly terrifies me. I was a nurse for 7 years. In my entire career, I worked at a single facility. The facility had many renovations done during the years as it opened in 1960. By 2011, when I started working there, only half the facility was the original building, and the rest had all been added over the years. I worked nights, mostly because I'm a night owl, and found it easier than morning work. I had a number of odd experiences, but I'll share the main ones that stick with me. Firstly, I had experiences with the supernatural since the age of 3, so I believe in the supernatural, but wasn't obsessed, more aware, if that makes sense. There was one wing in particular that was part of the original building, which had a small sitting room and a television for residents to enjoy during the day. During my night shifts, this one area gave me such a feeling of dread and fear that I would only be near it for as long as I had to. I would go out of my way and take the long way back to the nurse's station just to avoid being near it. Nothing I knew ever happened there, but my gut feeling was screaming at me that there was something there, and it was not happy. This feeling eased during daylight, but once it was night, the feeling was there. It felt as if someone was watching me, and they didn't like the fact that I was there. I spoke to a few other nurses about this, and they all claimed they experienced the same feeling. One other experience sticks out to me. A 90-year-old woman called Jane went to breakfast and asked to be taken back to her room for a sleep. She was a very healthy woman, but she said she wasn't feeling well. When the nurse did her next round 20 minutes later, they found that the resident had passed away in her sleep. I found out it was an aortic aneurysm, so she didn't suffer. Unfortunately, death is rarely quick in aged care, so usually a slow process of days or weeks. Jane was a very sweet Polish lady. She had outlived her children and her husband had passed many years ago, so she never had visitors. I would check on her and bring her tea at exactly 9:30 p.m. and say goodnight. As you could probably guess, not everything goes to schedule in healthcare, and it was not always possible to stick to a strict routine. But if it got to 9:35, she would ring her call bell and ask for her tea, then apologize profusely for ringing her bell, and every time I answered with, "Whenever you need help, press the button, it's not trouble, I love to help." She would then say her usual, "Good night, sweet girl," and I'd leave and get on with my shift. The funeral home was late to pick her up, and I helped the undertaker in the afternoon when my shift started. All the rooms had a call bell next to the toilet, one next to the bed, and the resident wore a necklace or bracelet with a call bell attached to it. When a resident passes, their room call bells are disconnected the same day, and the personal bell is put in the nurse's station ready for the next person to move in. At 9:36, the call bell went to her room started ringing again. This wasn't possible. Her room had been disconnected, and her personal bell was sitting in a drawer next to me. Slightly freaked, I went down to her room and checked to make sure there wasn't a dementia patient who just wandered in there. Maybe maintenance hadn't turned the bell off, even though I personally spoke to them after they did so. It was just trying to rationalize it, I suppose. I went into the room and it was pitch black. No one was inside and the bell had definitely been turned off, and I was unable to turn it off from inside the room, so I had to cancel it from the main desk. I instantly had a feeling of peace. Weird, because in every other situation I would have been a mess. I think perhaps she was just saying goodbye. As I was closing the door to her room, I heard a shriek, and my best friend came running down the corridor crying in a state. Once I got her to calm down, she said she was in the other wing chatting to Jane as she walked past her in her nightie. Then she turned the corner to the front wing, but when she looked around the corner she wasn't there. She's dead. What the hell did she just see? This was last summer, about a year ago. I was in rehab and decided to make a Ouija board, and me and my 3 roommates all agreed we would try it out. We were all very skeptical, mostly leaning towards the side of disbelief, but still open. It was a full moon that night. We started by all holding hands in a circle around the board and saying that we were open to spirits, willing to talk, and I guess just putting the energy out there. We then took the planchette and moved it around the board in circles a few times. We were in rehab with no access to the internet, so kind of just doing what we felt was right. and weren't sure on proper procedures. When we were all moving our hands, we were heavy on the board, and you could feel it being dragged. I will admit I tried moving it on my own, as well as in the beginning just to mess with my friends, but again the planchette felt like it was being dragged. But then I stopped and began to take it seriously, and when it was actually moving, it's hard to explain, but there was an entirely different energy to it. It glides across the board like butter. The board and planchette, of course, were made of cardboard, so it freaked us all out. Sometimes a couple of us would take our hands off, or we'd tell another girl to move her hand and it would keep going. It spells one of the girls' names, Sally. We asked who's contacting her, and it said, sister. Sally had a little sister that died under her care when they were small. Sally was scared. She asked for its name and it spelled F-L-O-R. I'm thinking maybe it's trying to say Florida but stopped, but at this point Sally is shaking and in tears. Her sister name was Flor. None of us knew that. After that I think we contacted another spirit and said that it was female and had been shot, and maybe another one. It's crazy because the energies feel different, like how it glides across the board. So now we're all total believers. I think maybe the next night or 2 nights after, me and my roommate decide to play. I think we contacted a spirit similar to the last one when all of a sudden the vibe completely changes. It spells out my name. And I'm like, oh no, as my name is very unique. And even though I believe in this now, that's the last thing I wanted to happen, for something to address me directly. Then the planchette starts zooming back and forth between A and Z really fast over and over, basically flying out of our hands. We're kind of scared, and no matter what we ask, it keeps repeating the same letters over and over, and we get spooked and stop playing. The next night we decide to try again, start like usual, putting forth our intentions, doing circles and asking how many spirits were there with us. My name was spelled out again, and I asked who it was, and it said father. My friend asked me if my dad was dead, so I said, no. We asked it what it wanted, and dude, it was spelling out painful, and then went back to doing the AZ thing. Deciding it wasn't going anywhere, we said goodbye and put it away. We tried one more night, but it was the same spirit messing with us with the same letters over and over. So, didn't do it again. The whole experience was so insane to me. I kept a journal of all of this when it happened. So I went and looked, and tried to give all the details I could for you to understand the experience. I was walking around the forest near my house with a friend, and we decided to cut off the path and see how deep we could get through the trees before they became too thick. Where I live is sort of mountainous, so it's pretty easy to walk among the trees without getting too caught up in branches. Everything is sort of spaced apart well. We walked for about an hour when we came to all these little arranged pebbles. They were all put in little circles of different sizes, and definitely put there intentionally. We kept walking and noticed that some of the circles also had crosses with them. Some serious Blair Witch stuff. We really should have just left, but we just so happened to have taken some acid, and this was 100% not a hallucination, and everything was hilarious to us. Eventually we kept walking and found a sign that explained it was an animal cemetery, at which point we realized we had been walking over hundreds of buried animal corpses. We noped out of there as quickly as we could, but because we hadn't followed the path, it was quite confusing to go back, and took much longer to arrive home. If that wasn't bad enough, we came across the biggest pure white dog we've ever seen on the way back. There was no one else around but this massive dog with no leash and no collar, and obviously, in our drugged up state, we convinced ourselves it was the ghost. It followed us as we tried to find our way for 20 minutes, when finally its owner wandered out and found him. It was some old hippie man who just let the dog wander around. Turns out the dog was so big because it was part wolf. Really not too unusual for where I live. But like I said, we were on acid, so the whole thing was more of a trip than we were expecting. We tried to find the cemetery again when sober, but couldn't figure out where we had veered off the path. Definitely the weirdest trip, and the creepiest thing I've ever found in the woods. Every summer, with a few friends, we take a trip to the seaside of France for about a week. Last year we decided to go to Hijacker on the southwestern coast for surfing, but ended up in a small touristic village called Mort, an hour from where we were supposed to be because of a messed up reservation. The week was going okay until the last 3 days of the trip. So the past 2 days we had been in trouble with the police and a few other tourists because of some misunderstandings over a pack of cigarettes. We had spent the last 2 nights stressing and trying to cool off, and therefore we thought the last night we spent there wasn't going to be as bad as those 2. And it couldn't possibly be, as we were leaving the next day very early in the morning, so we had only planned to go to a restaurant for dinner with some friends that we had met there to celebrate the trip. The dinner was going great. We were all having fun, and as time passed by, it started to get dark. Towards the end of the meal, my best friend Dennis, who was driving us home the next day, thought it would be best for him to leave early and not drink too much so that he could sleep as soon as possible and be in the best shape for the long drive that was coming. He left about 15 minutes before the rest of the group. While we stayed and drank a bit more, we paid with the check. And as soon as I got up from my chair, I received a message from Dennis. "Call me. There's a guy following me." Here's what happened. Dennis had to pass through a caravan parking lot and a golf to get back to the residence, in which we had rented a house. While he was in the parking lot, he noticed someone behind him that was about 1.7 meters, roughly his size, with a hood and a cap on it. At first, he didn't think anything of him, as the village was actually quite touristic and there were a lot of people usually passing by the car park. But when Dennis stopped to pee on a tree, he had a glimpse of the guy behind him stopping and hiding behind another tree a few feet back. As soon as he got walking again, the guy stepped out from behind the tree and started following him again against the golf. As Dennis got there, he was a bit creeped out, especially since at night the golf is completely dark and only illuminated by moonlight. It is completely devoid of people, and he stopped again for a second time to light a cigarette and check if the guy was still behind him. Once again, the guy stepped out of the path and hid behind a tree, until Dennis started walking again. That's when he understood he was in danger. This guy wasn't physically imposing, and so Dennis thought it was weird he was so confident in following him. Maybe because he was holding onto a knife or gun. Nevertheless, Dennis kept walking and acting as if he hadn't noticed anything, although the guy was following him again and sent me the message, "Call me, there's a guy following me." As soon as I picked up, he spoke loudly to try and scare off the guy. "Hey, you're at the golf with the other 8? No problem, I'll be there in a minute." Even though we were 5 and absolutely no way near the golf, it was terrifying for me. But it was clever because it made me understand he wasn't joking, and where he was. I swore to him that everything was going to be okay, and that I would be there in 5, and told him to be careful and try and get home safely. As soon as I hung up, I began running towards where he was and explained very briefly to my friend that Dennis was in trouble, and that we had to get there ASAP. Meanwhile, when I hung up, Dennis put the phone back in his pocket and kept walking. He took a glance back and saw the guy that was still a few meters behind him. He took a last puff of the cigarette he had lit 2 minutes before and threw it to the ground and began running towards the residence. As he was running, he took a look back and saw the guy began running too. The chase lasted 5 minutes before he got in front of our house, which was empty. When he got there, he stopped for a second, looked back, and the guy was 10 meters behind him, in the middle of the alley, immobile, and then went to hide behind one of the cars that were on the side of it. As soon as Dennis saw that, he panicked, barged into the house, locked the door with difficulty, and grabbed the biggest knife he could, and waited on the couch, facing the entrance to the house, which was a glass canopy. When me and my friends got there, he was scared but unhurt, and he explained everything to us. We then went looking for the guy. The neighbors hadn't seen anyone other than us, and even though we got to the residence at first in separate groups at different times, and through the 2 different entrances, we didn't see anyone coming out of them. He had completely vanished. Nothing was stolen even though we had left clothes to dry outside, and nobody was hurt. So we didn't call the police, but warned the neighbors, and me and 2 others stayed up all night outside as lookouts for the guy, as he had seen where we lived, and we were afraid he'd return during the night. Dennis had been lucky. We never knew what were the intentions of the guy, or if he was hiding something that gave him the advantage over my friend. Furthermore, he didn't even try to get into the house, and good for Dennis, because there was another entrance to the house, another glass canopy that led out to one of our friend's rooms, which had not been closed correctly. We couldn't even understand why he did that. Did he want to steal from Dennis? Or maybe something worse? We didn't call the cops back then, because of the trouble we'd had with them over the past 2 days, and the problem with the pack of cigarettes. Also, after those 3 days had gone wrong, we just wanted it to end and go home and sleep. I regret not calling them now, but it's too late, and I hope the guy hasn't creeped on anyone since. To preface this, I love to drive. Long hour drives to nowhere with no destination in mind. Just me, my music, and the road ahead of me. Living in Nebraska, I'd often take back roads or lonely highways cutting through the countryside to small towns and eventually cities, and I'd like to usually take these drives at night, since there was much less traffic to worry about. I've done it since I've had my license for the past 4 or 5 years, and I've never once had any sort of issue, nor run into any trouble of any sort. This was, until a few nights ago. For reference, I'm a relatively small 22-year-old female, and as I've stated before, I often take these drives completely and utterly alone. They're a good way to clear my head when I'm stressed, upset, or overwhelmed, or for me to get a plan together or sort out personal issues. I've also done these long and lonely drives to get away from the toxicity of my household when I used to live with my parents as a mean of coping with their alcoholism. Though now that I've moved out and I'm in a much better place mentally, I don't really have the urge to get in my car and just drive anymore. However, on the night this event took place, I was feeling pretty overwhelmed, stressed and anxious with a cluster of personal issues I'd rather not get into. I felt restless and irritable around my boyfriend and couldn't focus on anything else, and decided I needed a drive to clear my head. My boyfriend was understanding and told me to be careful and to not be gone for too terribly long since it was getting pretty late. I agreed, gave him a kiss goodbye, and left. I drove around our city for about 30 minutes, but I was still feeling on edge about everything transpiring in my personal life, so I decided to drive further north, down those familiar, dark, winding one-lane highways. I kept the car at a steady 65 miles per hour, taking the turns at a slower pace in case a deer jumped out around the bend, and was just admiring the vast, empty darkness of the snow-capped fields and barren trees. It was honestly a bit creepy being all alone with no cars in sight, in seemingly the middle of nowhere. The few houses I'd seen were now miles back, the road lightless, and the dead cornfields withered away and were covered in snow. It was like something out of a horror movie, and I half expected to see a ghost pop up my rearview mirror or see someone clamber out from the patches of trees dotting the horizon. The only light came from my headlight, and even then, I still strained to see through the inky darkness of the night. By now it was just after 11, and I told myself that once I made the familiar roundabout that would either take you to a small town or back towards the city, I would head back towards the city and home. The roundabout was still 15 to 25 minutes away, but other than my imagination picturing the worst, I wasn't really at all concerned. I mean, I was by myself, but I didn't have any other motorists to worry about, right? Wrong. As I round another bend, I notice a vehicle with its hazards flashing maybe a quarter of a mile or something away from me. It was some sort of sedan, dark-colored, and was angled to where only part of it was on the shoulder, while the rest was jutted out on the road, like they had to pull over in a hurry but didn't quite manage to do it. The driver's side door was flung wide open, and as I slowed my vehicle down and angled it towards the opposite side of the road to pass, I could make out what looked like maybe blood on the inside of the open door. I didn't see anyone on the road or in the car, and I was the only motorist in sight. The cell phone reception was spotty at best in this part of the country, but more often than not, you couldn't get reception no matter how hard you prayed, which was definitely the case when I took a glance at my phone to see if I had any service. So a lone female on the road at night, pulling up near a vacant vehicle that looks like someone had been attacked on or inside of, with no cell service. Now, I'm no dummy. I've watched countless episodes of Investigation Discovery and Criminal Minds and read far too many true crime books to know that this had bad and danger written all over it. But there was a still, small part of me that was worried something terrible had happened to whomever was in that vehicle, and I thought I needed to help. These roads didn't get a lot of traffic late at night, and temperatures were well below freezing. If someone were hurt or in trouble, there was no one and nothing else to help them but me. Still, I erred on the side of caution. I was still driving my car, though a bit more slowly, and as I approached the vehicle, I rolled down my passenger window a bit, shut off the music and called out, "Hey? Anyone there? You okay?" I didn't hear a response. I worried they were passed out somewhere, but I wasn't about to get out and look for them. I told myself I'd call out one last time, and if I didn't hear anything I would leave, and the moment there was reception I'd call it in, and if I did hear someone, well then I'd get to that bridge when I came to it. So I shouted again, "Hey, what happened? Are you okay?" There was silence for a beat. Then I heard rustling in the shadows of the trees, followed by a gruff voice saying, "Yeah?" I was relieved at first, and was about to say something in response or possibly even stop my car and get out, when I noticed three things simultaneously. As I inched my way past the front of the sedan, I noticed there was no damage to the hood or anywhere else on the vehicle, which I found to be strange considering the blood on the inside of the door. In my rearview mirror, I caught a glance of someone coming out from behind the sedan, and they were making their way towards my car fast. The person did not have any blood on them, nor appeared injured in any way, wearing a mask, not like a face mask for COVID or ski mask or anything normal, but one of those masks you could see being used in the Purge movies, and they were holding something in their hand. I don't know what it was, I didn't get a good enough look, but from its length and shape, my best guess would be a tire iron or a crowbar. I don't even need to say that I slammed on the gas at that very moment and drove like a bat out of hell, my heart thundering in my chest and my entire body shaking. My window was still rolled down in my haste and the music was still shut off, so I could very clearly hear someone, definitely a man, shouting at me. Though I had no clue what they were saying, I just knew I had to get out of there immediately. I stole one last look in my rearview mirror as I drove away, mostly to see if they were getting in their sedan to follow chase or if they had stopped. The man with the weapon was still standing in the middle of the road watching me, and right before I looked away from the mirror I saw a second man emerge from the trees that had been rustling earlier, also wearing one of those creepy masks and no trace of blood on him. I probably broke every law for speeding that night, but wanted to get away from those men as quickly as possible. As soon as I made it to the roundabout, I turned towards town, parked in a Walmart parking lot that thankfully still had cars in it from who I assumed were workers closing up shop, and proceeded to have a full-on meltdown. When I could pull myself together, I called one of my friends who was a police officer to tell him what happened, and asked what I should do. He was concerned for me after asking if I was okay, where I was, and if they followed. He told me since it was out of the city limits, he couldn't do much on his end, but he could get in contact with the local police sheriff in that jurisdiction to take my statement and check it out. I agreed and thanked him, and while I waited for police to show up, I called my boyfriend. Through my hysterical sobs and panic, I managed to tell him what happened, not even 10 minutes or so ago. He was, as you can imagine, super freaked for my safety, and wanted me to either come home immediately or drive down himself to take me home. I told him the police were on their way to take my statement, so I couldn't leave and that I was okay. But I stayed on the phone with him until I saw the familiar police cruiser pulling into the lot. I gave the police my statement, and they assured me they would go back to the spot I told them the sedan had been to take a look, and they would try and catch the guys who did it. Though with no cameras or no description of the men, I wasn't sure they'd be able to. I didn't even get the license plate number, though at the time of my panic, the thought never came to me until the police were asking if I got it. All they had to go off of was guys in a dark-colored sedan wearing masks. After I gave my statement, I went home and stayed curled up close to my boyfriend the whole night, listening to every sound the house made in fear it would be those guys arriving any minute to finish whatever they had started. Since the incident, I haven't heard back from police about whether or not they had any leads. I'm not sure they ever will. I'm just thankful I'm still here, and that I didn't stop to get out my car, because I'm not sure what would have happened if I did. I still have so many questions that have no answers. What were they doing? Why? What was the blood on the inside of their car? Was it a ruse to get more attention? Or was it really blood? Did they hurt someone? What would have happened to me if I'd have stopped my car? Needless to say, I won't be going on any late-night drives to anywhere for a while, and I hope I never cross paths with those freaks again. This summer, I decided to pick up some graveyard shifts at my current full-time job, simply because it pays more, and I am a university student drowning in student debt. About 2 weeks ago, on the rare occasion that I get to sleep during the time the sun is down, at 3:30 to 4 a.m., I was suddenly awoken by a loud sound. Me being half asleep, I honestly didn't know what the sound was exactly. So I just chopped it up to being one of my neighbors dropping something, because I live in an apartment with very thin walls. So I was just trying to go back to sleep. After about 10 minutes of laying there with my eye closed, I hear the sound again. But this time I'm pretty much awake, so I recognize what the sound is immediately. Someone was knocking on my window. For context, I'm a single female living alone in a basement suite, so my windows are basically level with the sidewalk. Anyway, obviously I'm freaked out. I don't know what the heck to do. I don't want to move and make any loud noises so they don't know I'm home, and I'm just frozen laying in this bed. Then I hear the knocking again. I instantly bolt up as my fight or flight kicks in and run to the front door, which has my keys with my pepper spray on it. The keys clink together and make a noticeable noise, and the knocking starts to get more intense and loud. This is when I realize the window with the screen by my bed is almost all the way open because my cats like to sit on the edge, and I forgot to close and lock it. I start to freak out, already having major anxiety. I search for my phone in case I need to ring the police. Me being clumsy and shaky, I drop my phone on the ground, and whoever is at my window proceeds to what sounds like slide either their fingernails or a sharp object down the screen. I realize that this person's intentions are to either come in or scare me, so like an idiot and not thinking, I run to the window as quickly as I can and slam it shut, and lock it while avoiding looking outside at whatever it was. The knocking stops, and I wait about half hour without hearing any knocking. I lay back down and go right back to sleep. The next morning, I honestly couldn't believe that it even happened to me. I start to think maybe it was a dream, so I go outside and investigate, and I see an empty beer bottle and a ripped-up blanket. I text my only friend that knows where I live and ask them if they were messing with me. They say no, which I figured because they don't drive and live quite far away. And the buses around my house stopped running well before 3 a.m. So I called my landlord and told him what happened, and he obviously said to ignore it, and that this happened before, which was creepy. I obviously recognize now I should have done a lot of things differently and called the police right away. It hasn't happened since. Nevertheless, it's still terrifying, but I can't afford to move again. I work in a rural mental health center in my hometown. This happened about a year after I started working there. I was also going to college full-time and only going to work part-time. I worked at the front desk at the time, and there was one particular client who took a liking to me. This guy had done a lot of meth in his day and basically fried his brain. He had drug-induced schizophrenia and is also really into conspiracy theories. At some point, we spoke while he was checking in, and he found out my mum's last name through that conversation. We have a different last name due to my parents' divorce, but for the life of me, I can't ever remember giving that personal information to a client. But it could have just been that he knew who my family was, since this was a rather small town. And basically everyone knows everyone. Not to mention my family owns a pretty large business in our town. He remembers me telling him, so really who knows. About a month or two after, he started calling, 2 or 3 times a day, for me. Keep in mind I'm not a clinician. I don't have any one client to talk to, so it's weird for a client to ask for me. But he would only call when I was in class or on PTO days. One day his clinician pulled me aside and told me he was concerned for my safety because of this client. The client had come in for an appointment and told his therapist that he had a premonition about me. Something bad was going to happen to me, and he was going to be the one who saved me. Apparently one night, while they were watching his regular unsolved crime shows, he ran across a story about Leah Rochelle Pebble, who just so happens to have gone missing in the same state I live in, and shares my last name, and her middle name is similar to my first. On top of that, my co-worker named AJ and Leah had a pimp named AJ. He had gotten it into his head that I was Leah and that I had been taken by my family and my co-workers and brainwashed into thinking who I now was, and as a result lost all the memories from my previous life. He was determined to save me and return me to my correct family. After that, I started noticing his car around pretty much wherever I went. He stalked my Facebook and messaged all the family members I had listed and my top friends. Luckily, I had told these people about this guy and not to engage with him. When he didn't get a reply, he wouldn't push it, except with my mum, who also worked in the facility. I worked just in IT. He would message her daily asking about me, asking why she took me and if she felt bad. I had to be walked in and out of work for about 6 months after, and I couldn't go anywhere in public alone. I think he dropped it eventually. I'm still not allowed to be up front when he's coming in, and occasionally still see his car drive by my house every once in a while, which is even creepier because I've moved twice since then. I tried to contact a paranormal entity, and some not-so-fun things happened. So this is the time my friends and I decided to be extra dumb. And I say this because I want all of those listening to understand that I, as well as my friends, now fully understand how stupid we were being. The important backstory for this location, Proctor Valley. Proctor Valley is in San Diego County and connects the towns of Otay and Jamal. It is protected and is a wildlife area, so there are no houses, no buildings, no businesses. It's situated behind a prominent mountain, with hilly ridges boxing in the valley. It is said that this valley is a center for the unexplained. Stories ranging from lights in the sky, ghost cars, ladies in white, random screams, the usual stories that surround almost every isolated dirt road. The place is surrounded with rumors. It is, however, in actuality, a dangerous place. Being situated near the US-Mexico border, it is a pathway frequented for drug smuggling, and being an isolated dirt road on the outskirts of a major city, things tend to go down there. You have your usual terrible stuff, like carjacking, people having their lives ended, as well as lots of bad other things. But a murder in particular stands out. The apparent poisoning of a teenage girl in a blue floral dress that was never identified, found barefoot on the side of the road. Now, time to share my experience. I had driven down the road late at night several times with friends for fun. The place has very few trees, let alone any large ones, but about midway down the road there is a very large tree hanging halfway over the road. This tree has always given me a bad feeling, so I never felt comfortable stopping there to explore. However, this night I was determined. So once and for all I had to know if this place had something weird going on. I wanted my own experience, and I wanted it badly. I had dug up my family's old Ouija board and studied for weeks on the proper use of it, and how to get the results you want. The whole shebang. We purchased the correct candles, and found the most pure salt we could find, and we drove out to the road. This ended up being a bit of an event, as about 10 people showed up. 4 of us used the Ouija board, 2 filmed, and 4 sat in lawn chairs. Once we all got ready, we began. I, being dumb and unoriginal, thought we should go straight to Demon Land and try to anger a demon and contact it. Which demon? Pazuzu. Again, I was dumb and unoriginal. Well, after we initially started, we heard what sounded like orchestral music being played. Being on a road, we figured it was another car driving down in the distance, but would wait for it to pass and continue, because it would be a bit awkward if someone drove by and a bunch of people were summoning a demon. We waited 25 minutes, but no car showed up. There were no headlights, no noise besides the music, and us being a bit confused and somewhat scared, we carried on. The planchette was moving, but based on the answers, someone had to be moving it. So when a random twig snapped and everyone jumped out of fear, I just stayed with my finger on the planchette. One person, the person moving the planchette, got too scared and opted out. So I and 2 others braved on. I did my best to anger whatever could be out there, and to my surprise we got a response. There was no music being played anymore, and the piece was moving. I asked if anyone was there, and if they wished to communicate. The piece slowly moved to yes in a slow, smooth motion that honestly felt terrifying. It felt like it was being dragged across the board, not like someone was pushing or sliding it. With the confirmation of something wishing to speak, I moved to the next question. Are you Pazuzu? The same feeling. The planchette moved to no. My heart sunk. I was thinking, okay, well I got something biting, let's see what it is. I see everything is fixed on the board, eyes locked, and I asked probably the next logical thing that most people would. Are you a good spirit? Then the 2 phones that were being used to film the event turn off. They then wouldn't turn back on, and the planchette begins to move. It slides to the letter G, and we all let out a big phew. Everyone was relieved it was going to spell good, but then unsurprisingly, it moved to O, more confirmation, but then it stopped. Nothing. No movement at all for over 5 minutes. It was telling us to leave. I asked, do you want us to go? And as I finished the question, my friend drops to her knees. She was screaming and crying. I moved the planchette to goodbye, and I say it and rush to her and ask her what happened. She said someone was walking over us and pointed down the road. I looked down, and all I saw was a cloud of dust roll off the road 15 feet away. This was the most honest person I'd ever known, and decided right then that we were leaving. She described the person walking towards us as having dark hair, long limbs, but no distinguished facial features. They walked like a video game character, glitching where they stride definitely didn't match pace at all, and their feet didn't seem to touch the ground. When she looked at it, she said she felt every emotion she'd ever felt come over her. She equated it to the feeling of your family dying while you win the lottery on your wedding day. This was almost 2 years ago, and my friend still refuses to go out at night. I tried a year ago, and she cried in the car the whole time, saying she's getting closer. And yes, she's been attending therapy for this. I don't know what she saw that night, but I personally don't want to find out. I have not returned to the road since. I stored away the board, but it went missing 6 days later to the day, along with the candles and books. When I was younger, I was part of a youth organization of sorts. One volunteer thing we did was regularly mow and do maintenance on an old cemetery. No one had been buried there since the 80s, but once we took care of it, people started using it again. Keep in mind, it's a really rural area. We're mowing and doing other stuff one day, and I was in high school at this point. It was near the end of the day, so most people had gathered by the gates. I was in the far corner, crouched down in tall grass, in part of the unused cemetery. I was going through an old pile of flowers, finding the years and years worth of plastic flowers that had been tossed away so that they could be disposed of properly. A few young kids come over and start playing in the tall grass. They are making their way towards me, and I could tell they hadn't seen me yet. When they got close, but still hadn't seen me, I said, "Stop walking on my grave." They instantly froze and looked around, and they took off sprinting so fast. One kid even started crying. Once my mum found out what I did, she was pissed, but I still thought it was hilarious. When I was a child, I was always stricken by this irrational fear that when I went outside at night, I had to walk straight into the house without looking back, because if I looked back, someone would be following me. One day after dinner, I went out to the car to get my book bag. I was continuing my ritual of walking straight inside without looking back. Adrenaline pumping, anxiety going full force, and I just stopped and said to myself, "This is stupid," and I made myself look back. When I looked back, I saw what appeared to be someone crouched down behind my mum's car, peeking their head around. They were just staring and smiling. It appeared to be a woman between her 30s and 40s with curly blonde hair. We made eye contact for a second, and then she ducked behind the car where I couldn't see her. I stood frozen for a second and then ran inside. I told my mum, and she went outside to check, but of course no one was there. My mum didn't exactly not believe me, but she wasn't very concerned either. To this day, I still find this story very spooky, and am still perplexed and have no idea what happened. Let me share it to you. I had a lot of work-related sites, ranging from downtown Baltimore to Virginia Beach and all around. Friday wrapped up, and I hit the road to some local arrangements I'd made for the weekend. And I spent the weekend with friends out in various parts of Virginia, and got dragged off to other places even further out. The usual weekend fun times. It's late Sunday night when I have to leave, or I'm not going to be able to get home to start my thankfully late afternoon on Monday. I'm fully rested, didn't do any drinking, and I'm not into drugs. On the highway about 3 a.m., in the middle of nowhere between Roanoke and DC, with absolutely no one around, I'm cruising along in the left lane, simply because no one else is near me. No headlights for the past hour, no taillights either. No road lamps, it's dark, mildly damp, it's foggy, and I've got the music on loud. I'm feeling pretty good. All is fine. And then, I just happen to look to the left, and out there I see a dog barking at me. A German Shepherd in a car passenger seat, somewhat blue glow from the instruments inside the car, and it's got its face to the window and it's barking its head off at me. I get a good hard look at it too, because at first my brain is not registering that it's a cop car. I'm doing 95 plus in a 75 and probably have the oh crap moment when the dog, the instrument, the white Crown Vic, the light bar and all in my brain clicks. And after a second hard look, I put my foot on the brakes and start slowing down hard but safe to pull over. I even put my blinkers on to start shifting lanes over to the right to pull over because, wait, there's no hard shoulder on the left side of the road. I look back to my left, where there is still no shoulder room for the other car, and it's just gone, without a trace. I slammed on my brakes and stopped in the middle of the highway, flipped on all my light bars, even looked around me with my handheld spot. There was nothing. No taillights, no headlights, no engine sounds, not a damn thing. There were no other tire marks in the damp but mine, and I could see a nice long distance for both ways. Complete emptiness. My vehicle had great visibility and a lot of extra lighting, as an off-road SUV with all the trimmings. There is no possible way someone pulled a sneaky, let alone drive that fast on wet, slopped grass and rocks on my left side. So, yeah. Cop Ghost and his dog didn't like me speeding, apparently. When my wife and I were house hunting, we went to a house that was in a pretty busy part of town, but sort of tucked back and out of the way of the main road. The outside was nice, big property, beautiful trees, but the backyard backed up to the main road, so you could hear the traffic. The owners had already vacated for the most part, other than staged furniture for showing. The upstairs was meh. Old carpets, outdated wallpaper, ancient kitchen. We weren't impressed. But we kept moving through, knowing we could talk down the price based on what we saw. The last thing we had to see was the basement, which you got to through the back of the kitchen. When I got to the top of the steps, I felt something. Maybe it was spidey sense. I don't know. I'm not really a sensing thing kind of person. My wife is very open to the supernatural and paranormal, and she felt the same thing. I stood on the top step and just felt this weird feeling. The feeling is hard to describe, but it legit made me stop in place. It was a feeling I've never had since. It was like I was walking into a dense, invisible fog that you could feel around you. The hairs on my arms stood up, and I just felt everything in my body saying, something is not right down here. But we walked down the steps, and it only got heavier as we went. When I got to the bottom of the steps, it felt like I was wrapped in a heavy, weighted vest and walking through sand. I looked at my wife and mouthed, "Do you feel that?" And the look on her face was one of just pure dread. She was pale white, and she was obviously feeling the same thing. She stayed at the bottom of the stairs and went, "I'm going back up." I don't think we needed to see anything else. Let's go. Before turning around and going upstairs, the realtor wanted to keep looking, so I moved through with her thinking we'd be quick. We opened a door and saw where the washer and dryers were, looked at the full bathroom, the sliding glass door out to the backyard, and then she goes, "I have no idea what this door is," and opened it. It was a flush panel, heavy metal door and frame that were painted to match the wall. We both thought maybe it was a fire safe, since it had such a heavy door and there were multiple locks on the outside. I mean, heavy locks. We opened it, and the room inside was maybe 5 foot by 5 foot and completely made of poured concrete, but it didn't look professionally done to me. It looked sort of sloppy and not quite smoothed out properly like a professional installation. It had 4 metal support poles in each corner of the room, about 3 inches from the walls, and they had clearly been recently painted white. The concrete floor and ceiling were painted grey, and there was a new metal drain covering that was in the dead centre of the room. The walls. I swear to God those walls looked like they had been filled with wall putty, like they were covering holes, but they weren't hole marks. Like they threw a glob on there and then smoothed it out over. It was long drawn out patches. The first thought was, that looks like the scratch marks had been covered up. I looked at the walls and the poles, and you could clearly see there had been something rubbing against the poles, like the metal had scratched in the pole themselves. The feeling I had when I looked in that room, it made me sick to my stomach. Like some kind of evil stuff went on in there. If I had just seen a picture of the room, I wouldn't have thought anything about it. But being there in person, the way the room made you feel, it was like something was kept in there, something alive that wasn't meant to be in there. I could have easily looked at the picture, even if someone pointed out and was like, maybe it's a BDSM room for those owners. But it wasn't a feeling of, this room was for mutual enjoyment, if that makes sense. I closed the door, and when it was shut, I was filled with an overwhelming sense of panic, of fear, of run, and I could feel shivers going up and down my spine. It was like something was standing right behind me, breathing down my neck. It wasn't my realtor, she was standing next to me, speculating the room could have been a makeshift fire safe. But the overall feeling and impression was that it was definitely not with good intentions. We started to leave, and we heard what sounded like a low moan, like someone was in pain. But there was nowhere for the noise to come from. We could see the entire basement from where we were at, and there was nothing. So we just went, maybe it's the wind outside, and started to move up the stairs. We made it to maybe the 4th and 2nd stair respectively, and the door to the basement, that had previously been opened and held open by a door jamb, slammed shut behind us. Like someone took the thing and used their full force to slam it closed. The realtor looked back at me and goes, I guess the air kicked on and forced it closed? I looked at her and just said, yeah, that's probably it. And we made our way up the stairs. When my wife and I were leaving, we sat in the car for a moment and I looked over at her and went, please tell me you felt that too. She responds with, babe, I'm so glad you couldn't see what I saw. I asked her what she saw, and she said the moment I got downstairs, there was a black thing, not a cloud or image or anything, but there was just a black transparent shadow behind me. She said the thing was huge and completely dwarfed me, like it went floor to ceiling in the basement. It was pretty tall and wide, maybe 2 of me standing side by side. She said when she saw it she froze, and that's why she tried to get me to go upstairs with her. It was something not friendly, she said, and was scared it was going to try and harm me, if it could. That whole experience changed my views on the paranormal forever. My dad died in 2016. I was able to spend a lot of time with him before he went, and my brother and I set him up in an amazing care facility in Australia, where he was for a few months before he went. The place had a small cafe with a barista, and I would frequently go and grab us a coffee. Dad couldn't walk anymore, and I was having a hard time getting him to a wheelchair to take him out of the room and outside. He also wasn't eating much or interested in much of anything. This was all pretty normal for someone who's dying. I knew he was, and I knew he'd go pretty soon, but nobody else seemed to think so for some reason. Anywho, I asked Dad if he'd like a latte, and for the first time in a few days he said yes. I was excited he was interested. So I headed over to the cafe, got us both a coffee and headed right back. I walked into the room and said, "I've got your coffee, Dad." I noticed Dad was staring into the far corner of the room. He looked from the corner of the room to me, and when I walked in, then after I spoke, he looked back to the corner and back at me and said, "What about Mum?" My mum died in 2008. Now, since I've seen ghosts and a bunch of weird experiences, I'm all aboard on this train. And without missing a beat, I look at the corner at him and say, "I can go get a coffee for Mum as well, no worries." And Dad looked from me to the corner, back at me, the reality clearly dawning on him. Then he quickly shook his head. While my dad did have some confusion when he first came to this place, he settled down pretty quick. He didn't see anything else after he mentioned that, and was lucid right up until the end. I'd like to think that my mum did come to see him off. When I was in my senior year of high school, one of my friends had a Ouija board that we would play with often. One night we decided to play the Ouija board at the cemetery because we wanted to see what would happen. We believed in the paranormal to some extent, but we were also skeptical. We just wanted to have a good time and hopefully get spooked. We specifically liked this cemetery because it was the easiest to sneak into. Its fence was a very low, short wall that you could hop over. There were recently dug places for new burials that were going to happen. We played a few times and spoke to some ghosts, nothing really scary or weird. We asked them if they were alone when they died, what their names were, etc. While playing, we started sensing this really awful smell, like rotten eggs and dead animal. We looked around and assumed it was coming from the holes that were freshly dug. We eventually left it because we got bored and the smell was gross. When we got in the car, we took off our shoes and started to sanitize our hands. That smell suddenly appeared out of nowhere. It was very strong. It smelled like death. We kept putting hand sanitizer on our hands, and when we would sniff them, it still smelled like it. After realizing the smell would not leave our hands, we all of a sudden got a chill and began screaming. We were all screaming inside my friend's car like girls from a horror movie. We finally calmed down and my friend turned on the engine and we bolted. We eventually started laughing because the whole ordeal was pretty funny, and we got what we wanted. But we'll never forget the smell, and how it wouldn't leave us be. I went to this school for 4 years, and still live really close to it. The years I went to this school were the only years I had sleep paralysis. It was built on a graveyard. They moved the graveyard somewhere close by because the area wasn't big enough, so they moved it and made a school where it had been before. The bodies were not moved because in our tradition, we don't bury the bodies within their coffins well dressed. We bury them with white fabric wrapped around them. They're naked, and this fabric is the only clothing they have. So it isn't really prudent to move the bodies. There were projections in every class. We were looking from Google, things like haunted places, possessed people, and scary paranormal stuff, almost every day. There were screams in our classroom sometimes, with no one behind them. The girls were really scared by these. Another day, someone found some writing on a board. It said sleep paralysis demon, and then it had my name and a few other personal and identifying details. On other times, the lights would start to fade, turn themselves on again, and then stop working completely. This happened just when the projection started to show the images, and then we learned that part of the light was the lighting exploding. Since we were looking at this kind of stuff in school, like ghosts and stuff, it's predictable, but we were also apparently summoning jinns. Basically, they are creatures that Muslims believe in, that they live in the same world as ours, but we can't see them, but they can see us. They're like spirits, I believe. One day we tried to summon a jinn, when something strange happened. Some of us who joined in the summoning went to the graveyard on a lunch break. A girl in class accidentally stepped on one of the graves and was so scared when she realized another girl, her friend, had something weird on her neck that wasn't there before. When we realized and told her, she began to cry for a long time. Everyone was very scared. We thought it was a joke at first, but the seriousness and intensity of her crying made us realize it wasn't, and I don't think those cries would be jokes. Her neck had what appeared to be the letters R and T scratched onto their surface and vanished the next day. We never spoke about that again. Another girl in our class was really interested in the paranormal. And said that it probably meant Spirit of God, and this scared everyone even more, as in our language the first two letters would be RT. Now, I need to say something everyone believes here. According to them, the street of the school is where you can see the light of someone that died, who was someone God loved so much. So now he is being a light to people in the street. The street also includes the new grave. When I was little, I remember being with my family passing from another street that also crosses that street. When I see a light, not a street light, an independent orb of light floating. But I was really little, so perhaps I was confused. In any case, this final story is from when my grandma went to my school working as someone who cleans. This was the first few years after the school was made. She told me that the principal cared about her opinion a lot, which was making another woman working there very jealous. When all of a sudden the principal started to act not so nice to her. Months, maybe even years later, when they were cleaning the principal's office, she claimed she found a paper that had Arabic letters on it. Then she got the paper, got rid of it, and the principal started to act nice to her again. So basically, my grandma assumes the other woman who worked there cast a spell on him so he would like my grandma less. My friend and I were coming back from a concert one night and were taking a shortcut through this area that was being worked on. So there wasn't really anyone around because it was late and the streets were closed. As we're crossing this small bridge, I looked up and saw what appeared to be a zombie rat jumping at my face. Scared the hell out of me. Turns out that someone had taken a mummified rat or squirrel and used wire to position it mid-air on that bridge. The combination of that and the abandoned atmosphere of the construction area was so creepy that we ran until we hit a busy street. My family moved into this house a few months ago, and my mum and I both experienced a lot of activity moving in. A few weeks ago I was playing piano in my room, which is the basement, and I get really frustrated while learning songs because I couldn't hit this one note, so I decided to take a break. When I was walking back to the piano, it played a key very loudly by itself. However, what really freaked me out was that it was the key that I was having trouble hitting. I immediately got full body shivers and felt extremely flushed and lightheaded. So I went up to my parents' room to tell them. My mum said she heard it play by itself while putting things in storage, but she had heard more than one key play. Also, my mum was taking live photos in the basement because she takes photos and she feels something in there. All the photos turned out to be normal except two. In the first one, you can hear a deep voice say, "They're watching." And the photo immediately after shows 5 large orbs in different places of the room. It's so crazy to me how the image coincides perfectly with what was said right before it. This house has been saged multiple times, but things keep happening. I don't know if I should just try and get more evidence or leave it alone, to avoid stirring up something bad. I also always see shadows moving, but never feel like I should necessarily be afraid. I'd like to preface this by saying that not all mental health professionals are terrible people. Good doctors and good medication saved my life. I didn't grow up in the US. So if you see something in this story that makes you go, "That's not how this works," keep in mind that in other countries, there might be different laws. I was a troubled kid. I'm kind of a troubled person in general, but when I was in my early teens, specifically in this story 14, I was cutting, suicidal, and refusing to go to school. So I was put on a waiting list for a children's mental hospital. I know now for a fact that I was on the waiting list for close to half a year, and that should have been the first warning sign. At that time, I enjoyed being on sick leave from school, which basically meant I got to play The Sims until 6 in the morning for 5 months straight. But when I had to pack my stuff and actually go to the hospital, I, of course, didn't really want to go. I didn't want to get help. Don't get me wrong, but the idea of being away from home for 6 weeks, which is the standard time they take to analyze you and watch you and give you a diagnosis, after which you can choose to pursue treatment, scares me. I arrived at the hospital in tears, my mum carrying my suitcase for me. The nurses noticed that obviously I didn't want to stay. "Are you here of your own free will?" the doctor asked me. I shook my head. They just shrugged it off, saying that they could get a judicial decision forcing me to stay here. I never got to talk to a judge. I never got to defend or explain myself, and as far as I knew, my parents didn't talk to a judge either. A judge glossed over my medical history and then signed a piece of paper that forced me to stay in the hellhole for the whole 6 weeks. The contents of my suitcase were searched, and I remember feeling like I had just arrived in prison. The first terrifying thing happened on my first night. As a cutter, my arms were in horrific shape. When my wounds healed, they'd itch. I scratched open some of my old scabs, and when I went to the nurse to ask for a bandage, everyone went nuts. In their eyes, I had purposely self-harmed, which they couldn't prove, but okay. So what do you do when a 14-year-old mental patient harms herself? Talk to her? Try to help? Nah. You take away all her jewelry, a necklace from my mom, a bracelet from my ex-girlfriend who, at the time, I still had very strong feelings for, and send her off out of her room for 24 hours. The timeout room was a small room with a big window that could just barely fit a bed. If I had to use the bathroom, I had to ask a nurse to accompany me. And no joke, at one point I was in the bathroom with a nurse standing guard in front of the door. She asked if I was doing okay, and I sarcastically responded with, "No, I'm cutting myself with toilet paper." She goes, "Really?" and rips open the door. All of my clothes, including my underwear and my PJs, were taken from my room and kept in the front office for the time I stayed in the timeout room. So whenever I needed clothes, I had to go up to the front office and ask for them. But apart from having to ask for clothes and bathroom trips, I was left completely alone in that room, and no one ever came to check on me. Getting out of the timeout room wasn't a lot better. For the first 2 weeks, I had horrible stomach problems. I would get up multiple times a night to use the bathroom, which, by the way, you didn't have one in your rooms, you had to walk down the hall to the bathrooms, because my stomach kept me up all night. I would often not get enough sleep, and would end up sleeping through the day, which led me to not taking part in the group activities. And instead of, I don't know, waking me up, I was scolded, and I quote, "If I was up all night roaming the halls, I'd be tired too. What do you want me to do, just crap in the bed?" And because I didn't partake in group activities, I couldn't earn outside time. Yes, I had to earn going outside. Even just sitting on the front steps with a nurse right next to me had to be earned. For the first 6 weeks, I was effectively locked up, except for school and weekends where I was allowed to go home. It was blatantly obvious that none of the nurses really cared about any of the patients. They weren't even real nurses, they were more like prison guards. One of them straight up looked like a homeless guy. Another sounded like she'd been a 5-pack-a-day smoker her whole life. And I mean, all of them were chain smokers. Every free second, they'd use for smoke breaks, right outside the door too, with the doors open, so that all the other kids who were currently going through nicotine withdrawals could smell the cigarette smoke. I saw a real nurse once a week. She mainly checked for self-harm. One time, I self-harmed at home over the weekend. I told her my pet bunny did it, and she believed me. Within 6 weeks of staying at the mental hospital, I saw a psychiatrist a whopping 2 times. Once for a general introduction, and once for an IQ test. Oh, and did I mention that you were allowed to have a razor in the shower? Or the huge bird spider that sat in the corner of one of the showers for the entire time I stayed there? Or the cobwebs and silver fish that were everywhere? Anyone who's ever struggled with mental illness probably knows that sentences like, "just pull yourself together," or "get over it," are the least helpful things one could say to a mentally ill person. I've never heard it that much in my entire life. There was one instance where another patient, who was deadly afraid of spiders, came running out of her room in a borderline panic attack because she had woken up to a spider directly in front of her face. Know what they told her? "Don't be such a baby, it's just a spider." They gave her a broom for her to get rid of the spider herself, which obviously she couldn't do. My roommate and I ended up helping her. Both of us were scared of spiders as well, mind you. But possibly the most outrageous thing that happened on my second to last day. Someone had told the guards that I had smuggled in a razor blade, so they pulled me out of breakfast and searched my body from top to bottom, stripping me naked, with the door to the nurse's room wide open. When they didn't find a razor blade on me, they tore my room apart. They didn't find one in there either, but found one laying in the floor of the hallway. It was still in a wrapper. I wasn't the only patient who cut herself. As a matter of fact, I don't think there was a single female patient who didn't. That blade could have belonged to anyone. They had no proof that it was mine. But of course, it was determined that it was mine, and despite me not having any new cuts on my arms, I was thrown into the timeout for another 24 hours. Literally my last 24 hours. And they paid so little attention to the timeout room that a fellow inmate was able to slip a letter with a razor blade inside under the door so I could take out my frustration on myself. In case any of you were wondering where my parents were in all of this, my mother wanted to get me out of that place as soon as she heard about the timeout room. But since my parents had joint custody, she needed my father to agree to it. My father deserves a let's not meet story on himself, but to make it short, he hadn't spoken to me in over 4 years, but was somehow convinced that I needed help and refused to get me out of there. My final diagnosis from that place? Narcissistic neurosis. I was 14, and to this day I have no idea how they came up with any kind of diagnosis, considering I had seen an actual doctor a total of 2 times. Additionally, this result was delivered to us, my parents and I, by the head doctor of the hospital, who I'd never seen in my life, during a conclusive meeting on my last day. I was offered to stay and start behavioral therapy, but I guess it goes without saying that I politely declined that offer. Every therapist and psychiatrist I have spoken to since, and trust me, there have been a few over the last 7 years, have disregarded that diagnosis completely. Some have even laughed at it. I'm currently diagnosed with bipolar disorder and depression, and a panic disorder, and my current psychiatrist has suggested I might suffer from borderline personality disorder. I guess the moral of the story is to always do research on the hospital you plan on getting yourself admitted to. I sure as hell hope I never have to see any of the guards, nurses, or doctors ever again. Outside my town, there is an old abandoned orphanage, and a memorial for all the children that were abused and passed away. And 5 of us decided it would be a great idea to go out there and explore it. We scoped the place out during the day to find ways to get in, and came back at night at around 11 to 11:30 p.m. We parked a few hundred meters down the road from it, out of sight just in case of police, and we began walking. We got close to the gate before one of my friends, who was the biggest skeptic adrenaline junkie alive, stops dead in his tracks, turns around, and starts sprinting, telling us that he saw someone in front of him. We all start running back towards the car. The entire time, there's rustling from the bushes like someone was following us. We get in the car and I turn around and see 2 to 3 figures clear as day standing behind the car, watching us drive off. 2 girls and a boy, between the ages of 13 and 16. So we decide to forget that and go to the witch's grave. In hindsight, an awful idea, but we were excited to go out and explore. I'm very into pendulum and actually had mine with me, and on the way up was communicating with a spirit that decided to follow us from the orphanage. Her name was Faith, and she was absolutely lovely. Around this time, I started getting a massive headache and my eyes were watering, but thought nothing of it. I started getting really tired and disassociated and fell asleep, or at least I thought I fell asleep. I woke up and it seemed like only 5 minutes had passed. We were just reaching the town with the grave, and one of the guys sitting beside me, Jay, was saying how I was staring out the window the entire time, going into a burst of laughter, and I sounded different, and my laugh was different. We pull up to the witch's grave. Jay swears that we saw someone walk past it. We made a Ouija board and wanted to communicate with spirits. I didn't want to get out the car, and neither did Jay. So we sat in the car listening to music while the rest of us sat in front of the grave messing with the board. Music started doing all funky and weird stuff. The radio was acting up, and prior everything was working perfectly. About 15 minutes pass, and Jay decides to get out to see how they're doing. He comes back in, followed by everyone else, seeming a little freaked out, and I asked what was wrong. And my other friend says that Jack was staring behind him. When he goes, "He's right behind you," he turned around and went back to the car. Jack had no memory of this, but the rest of the guys backed him up. The music stopped working, and we started driving back down the mountain. It got incredibly cold even with the heater on, so I started getting a massive headache behind my head and back of my ears, which is apparently a sign of spiritual attachment. Charlie is driving, Darren is in the passenger seat, and Michael was right, with Jay in the middle and I was on the left seat. Jay started tearing up a little bit and went silent before he started laughing. He turned to me very slowly with the biggest grin on his face and just stared. I asked him what he was doing, and he never replied. A few minutes later he was himself again. Charlie a few minutes later started spacing out really bad. We were using the pendulum, consulting and asking if there were any possible harm coming out this way, in which it violently answered yes, and we all yelled for Charlie to pull over. He was refusing, but eventually he did, and they swapped seats. I blacked out from there. From here I only remember what the guys filled me in on and what happened. So apparently, Charlie joked and said they should use the Ouija board and see what it wants. Upon that, my other friend replied in the most polite and formal tone that they should. Keep in mind that it's also the only thing he said the entire time, and I agreed with him, despite being very against wanting to use the board before. Apparently the 3 of them all decided it would be the best option to get some sage and burn it away, whatever it was that was attached. I'm the only person who owns sage, and upon hearing the mention of it, they said I burst out crying, apologizing and begging for them to not get it, saying that I didn't want to leave. Jay was freaking out, so him and Darren swapped seats. Darren's family is a line of white witches, so apparently he tried his best to bless both Charlie and myself, in which my responses to that were violently pushing him off me, thrashing about repeatedly and saying no, and very coldly and calmly saying, "I don't like that. Darren is like one of my best friends, and I hold no ill will against him. So they do the sage. I let them in, and flat out refused to touch the sage and stood very far away from it. I got in the car and headed towards the riverbank. It was pliant but very slow to follow. They described him to be a zombie, my other friend. I was resisting, hesitating, crying and refusing to follow them, so they practically dragged me along. As soon as the sage was lit, they told me that I bolted and got as far away from it as possible and tried to jump over the edge of the river. They had to grab me and forcibly hold me and drag me in place. They said I was crying violently and that this would be over soon. I wake up. I was on the ground, still being held, with Darren raving the sage around me. Charlie checked on his phone and the first thing he said was, "It's only 1 a.m. 2 minutes ago." I felt confused and disoriented and tired. So of course, the best action for all of us was to go home and sleep it off. I stayed with my friends for the night, woke up the next day feeling like I just drank 2 bottles of vodka and went home. I still felt awful, so I went home, the headache behind my ears, and that still wasn't good. I felt cold despite having no fever, and it was a warm day, and I was wearing a hoodie. I was hearing knocking noises and footsteps outside my door. I had bad heart pain, I was throwing up, and my nose was bleeding badly. My friends messaged me saying that there was something wrong. Their mom was concerned about me, and they were coming to get me. So I went with them back to theirs. I explained to Jay's mom and dad what happened. Jay's dad, who doesn't really believe in this kind of stuff, but both of them had had paranormal experiences before, told me to go outside and stand on the grass, barefoot, and ground myself. That kind of worked. My other friend also turned around to stare at the gate because we both heard and saw something, and Jay's mum later confirmed that she saw it too. Ever since then, I see and hear things 100 times more than I used to, and I always carry obsidian with me. A few years back, I was driving on this back road between 2 or 3 a.m. after hanging out with a few friends. There was no one on the road, certainly no one walking, and it was incredibly foggy. The area here is a small protected wetland, and visibility was maybe 30 to 40 feet at best. There is a 90-degree turn. As I am turning, there's a man standing there, arms at his sides, wearing ragged clothes, just standing perfectly still, about 2 feet in the road. I nearly hit him, but was certainly closer to crapping my pants than anything else. Growing up, my family frequently traveled to rural Mexico. Almost everyone there believes in supernatural things, and are very superstitious. I am honestly a skeptic in many things, but I did see a few things that I can't explain. This is one of them. Light orbs. Growing up, I heard many stories of strange light orbs. Everyone believes they're witches. One of my uncles, who was a retired soldier, woke up one night as usual to feed his sheep at 6 a.m. He said he saw a big orb fly above his barn. He watched it for a few minutes and decided the best thing to do was shoot at it with a rifle. He says this was a Vietnam-era M4. He fired a few shots and saw they hit the orb, which was spinning like crazy, and it charged towards him as he ran inside his house. He waited all day and night inside. He believes it was a witch. I loved that story as a child, but thought it was a lie until I got to see them. In Mexico, it is common for teenagers to go to parties to the next town over. One of my cousins had a truck, and it would get filled inside the cab and on the bed. There would be maybe 12 of us on our way back at around 1 a.m. I was riding in the back of the truck, and I was tired, so I wasn't paying attention to my surroundings until the truck stopped. Someone inside pointed at a small hill which had a cemetery on top. There they were. 3 orbs around the cemetery, circling about 20 feet above it. They had to be about the size of a Volkswagen Beetle. We were about half a mile away and just stared at them for about 3 minutes. They would circle the cemetery, dropped to the tombs and went back up. Then all of a sudden, they just went up and didn't want to come back down. I have to admit, I was yelling at my cousin to go. I was afraid I didn't want to die at a glowing orb. This happened in February of last year. We have a cottage about 45 minutes away from my parents' main home. It's not too far from Huntsville/Muskoka, Ontario, if anyone wants a visual. The thing is, it's completely unfinished. The basement has no proper flooring and has a slight water leak now and then, especially now. So there are plenty of fans and dehumidifiers running. As a result, one of us needs to check on the place at least once every 2 to 3 weeks to empty the dehumidifier in the basement and make sure everything's alright. To describe the house layout a bit, the entrance to the basement is directly in front of the main entrance. It's a long, skinny staircase down with a low roof, so you need to crouch on the way down. There is one crappy light bulb in the ceiling, so it's always very dark down there. There's one big room, then 2 hallways branching off. One hallway leads to a bedroom, and the other leads to not only a second bedroom but also a washroom, all of which are completely unfinished and without lighting. The second hallway is much longer, and the rooms are just way off in the back corner of the basement and are completely dark. In other words, it's creepy looking. So let's take you to the day it happened. My mum and I are heading up there to empty the dehumidifier, have some lunch and clean out some junk, as we're slowly gutting the place. It had been nearly 3 weeks since we'd checked up on the place at this point. We stopped at a McDonald's beforehand, and each got a fish combo. First time trying one was actually not that bad. We get into the place and put our food on the table, then turn the heat on. The first thing we do is run downstairs to turn the water on and check the dehumidifier. After turning on the water, we head over to the dehumidifier and notice that there's hardly any water in it. It looks like it's only been running for a few days. There's still the regular amount of moisture on the ground, but it was strangely empty. My mum and I head upstairs and she grabs her phone to text my dad and ask if he had stopped by to empty it recently. He said he had not. We were both puzzled as to why it looked so empty, but never considered there was something else afoot. After heating up our food, we both sit down at the table and turn on the TV. About 5 minutes into our meal, we hear a massive bang downstairs, almost as if someone stubbed their toe really badly on a cupboard or something. We instantly jump and looked at one another with a freaked out look on our faces. The TV is still playing rather quietly. We then hear the worst thing. A small grunt coming from downstairs. It was unmistakably a human vocal sound. "Was that a person?" my mum whispers, and I nod. It was freaky. I wasn't really taking it very seriously for some reason. Looking back, it was pretty serious. They could have been dangerous. I told her to grab a jacket and that we should leave and call the police. So we gathered our things and I grabbed the kitchen knife on the way out. If you recall, the entrance to the basement is directly across from the main entrance to the house. So I had to make this peek around the corner and was fully expecting to see a person on the dark staircase. But luckily for me, it was just a series of stairs down into the dark abyss. Once we're out front, we jump in my car and she calls the cops immediately. Within 3 minutes, 4 cruisers show up and 5 cops get out. We told them what had happened, and they headed down the driveway. They were in the house for about 10 minutes before the door opened. A few cops walked out and boom, The third cop brought out a short, chubby guy with long black hair and pop bottle glasses. They brought him out handcuffed on the front steps, and another cop had a bag that looked like his belongings. We were in our car, which was up the street a bit and facing away from the entrance of the cottage. But my mum turned away as soon as he was brought up the driveway. She didn't want to get a good look at him, as the whole situation was quite unsettling for her. They loaded him in the back of one of the cruisers and took him away. One cop came over and spoke with my mum for a bit about the situation. Ultimately, my parents had decided not to press charges against the guy. He was just sleeping on the cold cement ground with a small roll-out mattress, even though there was a proper bed upstairs. This just made us think he'd been down there in the back hallway in the unfinished bedroom for a while. We probably walked downstairs to empty the dehumidifier and turn on and off the hot water a number of times, and he was 15 feet away in one of those bedrooms. He probably wasn't a bad person, and I'm thankful that at least he decided to empty the dehumidifier. Hopefully, he lived in there for most of the colder months this past winter. We were just lucky he didn't turn out to be one of the crazy squatters. I worked as a food delivery person in a hospital when I was younger. I mainly worked on the floor that was like a nursing home for older patients. I took a tray into a room once and asked the woman if I should leave it on her tray or if she was going to get up and go to her table. She told me not to bother because she wouldn't be needing food anymore. I was required to leave it, so I just said okay and left it on the table. I went back about an hour later to pick up trays and her room was empty. She'd passed away. I'll never forget that. I used to work med-surg. Sometimes when the ICU had room, they'll put some overflow patients down there, and we'll float down to take care of them. About 3 or 4 months ago, I floated down there. It was great because I only had to manage 3 patients, and I'm used to having 6 or 7. I hear some commotion and yelling down the hall, so I ran down there to see if the nurses needed help. I get to the room and see the nurse tech backed against the wall crying, and 3 ICU nurses trying to hold this man down, while a 4th gives him Altivan. Apparently he was withdrawing really bad from both alcohol and narcotics. I listened to him and realized what he was freaking out about. He was trying to sit up and scoot back, and he's screaming, "My legs, let go of my legs, you're burning me. Guys, it's trying to pull me off the bed and it's burning me." His legs were in soft restraints, and the nurse by his feet was trying to check to see what was wrong with them. But she wasn't pulling on them at all. But even when she wasn't touching his feet, he was screaming. Because someone wouldn't let go and they were burning him apparently. Almost like a demon was trying to pull him to hell. He died within about an hour and a half of that. I don't know why, but it scared me so badly that I thought I was going to puke for the rest of the night. My dad is a doctor. When he was a resident, he attended a woman who was in an ATV, the 4-wheeler type. It was a big accident. After a few surgeries, they managed to stabilize her. My dad didn't perform surgeries, he just assisted. A few days later, when he was doing routine checkups on her, she was awake and he came in the room. My dad asked her a few questions, and after a few of them she interrupted him, sat down on the bed and said, "You're a really good doctor. You've done what you can, but it's of no help. I'm going to die very soon." My dad claimed she looked very pale and said those words very calmly, and died a few hours after that. I have cared for many elderly residents passing away, but my favorite story was a sweet lady called Vi. She was very weak and just beginning the process of actively dying. We were trying to pull her nightgown up to make sure she was dry, but she started fighting us tooth and nail to keep her gown down, while she stared into space. She'd never given us any lick of trouble in the department, and she had no modesty issues with the staff. We waited a couple of minutes and tried again, but she kept looking at the ceiling and batting us away with her hand. She was stone deaf, so there was no point explaining ourselves. Finally, on our third attempt, Vi motioned with her hand and shouted, "Not in front of the angels." We backed off for a while after that, and she passed away that same night. Years ago, my father worked security at a hospital. The only place he didn't like patrolling was the morgue. There really wasn't a whole lot going on in the morgue, but sometimes the dead people on the table or vault would get up, moan, fart, burp, and other things that dead bodies do. Even though my father knew there was no need to worry, it still startled him. Sometimes a hospital nearby would use the morgue if they had overruns, and also the local police department would use it. So one day, my dad's at work. He's talking to a receptionist called Debbie, who is a large, middle-aged older woman, and seems to be in okay health. They're just chit-chatting, usual small talk, and she lets him know she's really not feeling good today, and that she hasn't felt good for the past few days. My father mentions to her that maybe she just needs to go home and rest. She's been working hard, and perhaps needs to take it easy for a while. As they're talking, she says, "No, this is a different kind of feeling," and that she genuinely feels really bad. So my father goes back at the end of his shift to check up on her and says he'll catch her on Monday because it's Friday and the weekend's coming up. Right as he was leaving the hospital though, he was overcome with a very uneasy feeling. So Monday comes in and she doesn't show up for work. Tuesday and Wednesday roll around and she still doesn't come in. So my father asked her co-workers about her, and they hadn't heard from her, so my father guesses she must be taking some time off. The week progresses and Friday comes around. While making his rounds, he has to inspect the morgue. As he goes in, he does a quick sweep, but his eyes are drawn to a fresh body laying on the slab in the middle. He casually shines his flashlight in the direction when his stomach drops. He sees the body of his co-worker lying there on the slab, dead. In my life, I have neither seen or felt anything I would classify as paranormal. Yet, I do believe it does exist, except what I decided to call the window episode and some Ouija tests. Here's my story. It must have been during high school. I was home just after being left alone by my father and brother, so I decided to make something to eat for myself when I heard it. Some rather strong knocks against my window. I assure you I was convinced my father or brother were back to get something that they must have forgotten, and just warned me of their presence. There had to be someone around the window. But there was nothing. No one. I checked all the windows in the house, but still nothing. So I just freezed for a few seconds, not understanding what happened. Was it bugs? Is it impossible for an insect to cause such a loud noise, multiple times? Birds, perhaps? The wind? In any case, could it have been the neighbors? But then again, they live on the opposite side of where my brain has located the sound, and I have definitely recognized the noise that my windows could produce. I had thought about this during at least more than 1 year, searching for any explanation, but there was still none. But there are two elements drawing my attention in this episode. First, I heard the noise a bit after being left alone, as if the thing that caused the noise was heading towards me and just waiting for me to be alone. Then I recently noticed that the window episode coincides with the period where I made a Ouija with friends. It wasn't a very troubling experience. The glass was moving, forming more or less credible answers, that's all. But if the window noise is linked to my Ouija experience, I admit it's a bit more troubling. I have to talk about this with my friends. I have to talk about this with the friends I made the Ouija with. None of them gave me any other explanation, and I haven't told my family this. Not even sure if they take it seriously. My friend and I Decided to go on a late night drive to find this creepy cemetery one night. Great start to a story, I know, but we were bored and in a small town with nothing else to do. After close to 40 minutes of driving, we got to the state park. Now typically, parks are closed after dark, but these roads were still public access, so they weren't off limits to general drivers. However, we were the only cars on the road at this point, and it was isolated, we thought. The lanes were surrounded by thick trees, and it was dark. No streetlight dark. We're on a narrow dirt lane looking for this cemetery, but we drive by it, unknowingly. The area we were driving through was kind of like a square of roads with only one way in and out. We get to the crossroads, where the road we are on goes straight through, or you can continue back through by a left-only turn. Next to the ditch across the road from us, we see a dark green sedan pulled into the brush. No lights on, no people around it. Not an accident from all we could tell. Whatever, kind of weird, but we slowly turned left and began to loop back around looking for the small rows of old headstones again. As we get back around the intersection about 5 minutes later, the green sedan is still pulled off in the bushes. But now, it's not the only vehicle there. There's a big pickup truck, idling in the dark across from us, blocking the straightaway. Now, it had to have come from the other direction since no other cars passed us or were in front of us or behind us. That was the way we had planned to go, to leave the park since we hadn't found what we were looking for, but we couldn't pass through. This truck was in the middle of the road, taking up all the space on either side. At first, we were thinking, this guy's pal probably got his car stuck and called for help. Then this truck guy turns on his headlights, his high beams, and starts revving his engine hard. My friend and I exchange looks, like wondering who's overcompensating for something, and when we turn back, trying to see through the blinding light, we see a silhouette of a big, bulky man. He's standing in front of the truck, hands on his hips, just standing there. We aren't a car's length and a half away from this guy, and there's nowhere to go but left, which we know just leads us back around to the same place. We sit staring at each other for a few moments, trying to decide what to do. My friend starts pulling the car forward at a snail pace, trying to keep as much distance between us and this truck as possible, and we make the left turn. He's just standing there, not moving, looking in our direction. We weren't scared yet, really, but I'm a bit paranoid generally, so I was waiting for him to lunge at the car, throw something at us or something. I don't know, it just really felt off. After we turn, I check the rear view and see the guy holding something as he takes a few steps behind our car in the outline of the light. It's long, barrel-shaped and threatening looking. We peel out of there now, wanting to put distance between us, but forgetting we are stuck in this square of roads. When we get back to about halfway, we begin to see the start of the straightaway in the truck, whose headlights we can still see. We pull off to the side of the road, trying to figure out how we can exactly get out of this situation. I look out the window and see that we are sitting right next to the cemetery we had been looking for, but we are both too freaked to get out now, and we laugh at the irony for a second. Then we see headlights coming from behind us. It's the guy, and it gets closer. We see it's a white SUV, and it slows next to our car. The window rolls down and it's a car full of guys our age. "What are you guys up to out here?" the driver says. "We're just here for a drive." And they say some stuff out of earshot. My friends and I don't have a strong menacing aura, so we hoped we could just send some chill vibes and have them leave us off the hook for whatever was going on. Were they with the truck guy? Because this wasn't truck guy, but was all too weird. We asked if they'd seen a truck ahead, where they had to have driven in, but they said that they hadn't. When we looked back, we noticed the lights from the oncoming direction were gone. They laugh and pull away slowly, telling us to have a good night, and we pull back onto the road and take off for the exit, only looking out the windows long enough to notice that only the sedan was still there. Sorry, buddy. Hope your car's alright. We made it back to his parents' place without further incident and told them about the encounter, but we couldn't explain what had happened really. It still kind of sounds stupid when I write it out, but something was going on. I was doing a road trip with a friend of mine when we arrived to a town that just felt off, almost like the writers of Twin Peaks had shown up and decided to take the inspiration for their show. Anyway, we stopped there for an emergency bathroom break. We were both naive, city-dwelling 18-year-old girls. The porta potty off the freeway near some dilapidated buildings was too gross to use, so we drove up ways to the main street. The only thing open at 2 p.m. on a Thursday was a craft shop, which my friend rushed into while I waited in the car, when a giant bald man with a crazed look in his eye came barreling out of nowhere and started slapping the side of our little Fiat, yelling at me that I was too pretty not to smile. I tried texting my friend to warn her, but had no service. He circled the car a few times, acting mean and drunk, shaking the entire vehicle, and was close to breaking a window. I'm no stranger to crackheads fried out on their mind, but this felt different. He seemed to have given up and walked a few steps away. My friend came out, noticed the look on my face, and we peeled out of there. And he chased our car for a lot longer than expected. Once I had cell service again, I looked up the town, and at the time I believe it was almost 25% felons, with a population of 300. I bought a new car several months ago, and had to drive the 395 from Reno to Vegas to get it. Damn lack of dealerships in northern Nevada. The trip down was fine, but going back north was later in the day when we left, and it was dark by the time we got to Walker Lake Reservation. Late summer, pitch black at about 10 p.m., and little do we know that the lake is known for midge swarms. I thought it started sprinkling rain as we rounded the bend, but soon started pumping my windshield wash as fast as I could, as my windshield was plastered with thousands of midges in a gigantic swarm over the road. I slowed to 40 to 20 as visibility was poor at best for a good 2-mile stretch of seemingly endless bug apocalypse. I ran out of windshield wiper fluid near the end and had to drive 15 miles to the next town, barely able to see. I had my sister-in-law with me, and I'm fairly certain it was the scariest moment of both of our lives to date. Don't go to Walker Lake in summer after dark. The place apparently gets spiders so bad in the summer, bushes look like wads of webbing. Also, so much for my new car being detailed. I'm fairly certain the garage still stinks of bug after that much power washing, and there's still guts hidden in every crevice of that car. This happened a while back. I had just obtained a new car and was visiting family in Lower Alabama. I decide to go for a late-night joyride, and everything's fine until I end up in some heavily wooded, deep back roads. This super thick fog starts moving in, so thick that I can no longer confidently drive faster than 10 to 15 miles per hour, and I had to turn my headlights off and rely on fog lights. I decide I need to pull over and use Google Maps to find directions back, since I couldn't even read street signs through the fog. I find an opening in the trees besides the road and pull over. No cell service. I sit for a minute and try to see if I can remember all my turns to get back. As I'm sitting there, the fog starts to clear ever so slightly, and I see that I am parked by a church that could be as old as 200 years, and I'm parked nearly atop of the cemetery. This is the part where if this were a horror movie, I'd go into the church and see if there's someone to give me directions. Nope. I just turned around and left immediately, and eventually found my way back. Nothing paranormal happened, but I was about 95% certain something paranormal was about to. To be honest, a part of me wished I'd checked out that church. There's an extreme curiosity. Everything seemed to lead me there, and present the church to me. Maybe a ghost needed my help. My mum, sister and I were on our way to a baseball game of mine during my junior year of high school. This was in northern New York, so spring got a little chilly at times. The main road we took stretched about 35 miles and was nothing but cornfields and tree lines. We hit a stretch of road that was super foggy, for no reason, so my mum slowed down to a proper speed. We finally reached the end of the fog, and we looked to the left to see where we were. About 50 yards from the road was a man and woman, in what appeared to be wedding clothes from at least 100 years ago. A man wearing a big top hat, and the woman wearing a very old-looking white dress holding hands with their back to us walking towards the wood line. We drove past, and I remember the silence in the car until my mum said, "What the hell was that?" Till this day, whenever we get together, and one of us tells the story, we all get goosebumps. My first job was at a skilled nursing facility. I usually worked day shift, but I had picked up night shift because they were so short-staffed. We only had a handful of people working at night, so it was pretty quiet. I'm sitting at the far end of the nurse's station, which is at the end of the back hallway. I hear a call light go off, and I remember thinking it was strange because the resident who lived in the room had end-stage dementia and didn't move much. I go to the room, and the blinds were moving, and the patient looked like she was sleeping. I called her name, and she didn't respond, which was her baseline. But then I put my hand on her shoulder, and she was dead cold. I turned the call light off and turned the light on. She had passed, and from the coolness of her skin and stiffness, I think it had been a while. I then went to find a CNA to help with her. I also figured the blinds were moving because of our old heater that sat under the blinds. I go back to my desk and check the chart for funeral information and such, and the call light goes off again. At this point I thought maybe a CNA was calling me to the room, so I walked back up down to the hallway to look for them. I then cancelled the call light from the nurse's station. There was no one around except for sleeping residents. I went to the nurse's station, where one of our CNAs was sitting reading a book. I told her what happened, and she said she had been there the whole time. We head back down the hallway to find the light going off again and the door shut. Maybe I had shut the door, and maybe the heater was moving the curtains, but I'll never quite understand the call light. I truly believe she was letting us know that her soul was free from her body, and that she wanted to say goodbye to us. She was a long-term resident who never had visitors, and I truly think we were all she had in the end. Nothing ever spooky happened in the room again, or at least not for the following year that I was there. I'm usually a pretty jumpy person when it comes to supernatural stories and such, but for some strange reason I wasn't scared at all. It was like a peaceful goodbye. I don't know how else to explain it. When I was in high school, I got the flu very badly. I had such a high fever the doctors were worried about seizures and/or brain damage. In the hospital, and after they were able to get me to a semi-human temperature, they wanted to x-ray my lungs for damage. I went to walk to radiology, but my doctor saw me, panicked, and said I should not be standing, let alone walking. So they plop me in a wheelchair and roll me down. My nurse situates me near the machine and tells me to wait there for her, and then we'd get started. She left the room, and I just was kind of looking around, waiting, and I saw another nurse, very pretty with dark hair, in the room. She told me to go with her. I shook my head and said no, and the other nurse said I needed to stay here. The pretty nurse asked if I was sure, and I said yes. My nurse came back and began to get me ready for my chest x-ray. It was then that I noticed that the door she entered from was the only one, and the pretty nurse was gone. So in the end, I think I was dying, and an angel told me to go with her, but I said no. I had a patient with cirrhosis related to fatty liver. I cancelled him heavily prior to this for him to lose weight, but he didn't heed my advice. He developed diabetes and then developed a terrible, non-healing ulcer on his leg, then the other. Both soon spread to gangrene and he was admitted to hospital for bilateral leg amputations. He only said one thing to me after he woke up after the operation. "Doctor, good news, I've lost a bit of weight." He died a few hours later. I miss him very much. Strange things have been happening in our flat. So for starters, I am a practicing pagan and have been my whole life. I am no stranger to the paranormal. I regularly sage our home or bless it while burning incense. We frequently have windows open, allowing a breeze through to whisk away any negative energy. I have a lot of experience with Ouija and seances. What I'm trying to say is that I'm not new to this kind of thing, but I'll be damned if they don't freak me out. I moved into the flat on the 14th of December 2018. When we came to view the flat, I immediately felt a positive energy. It was like I belonged there with my little one. The energy remained positive for the longest time, and little things happened. For example, I'd put my phone down in the living room, pop up to check on my daughter, come back and my phone would be nowhere. I would spend the next 10 to 15 minutes searching for it everywhere to no avail. Then I'd go back to where I had left it, and you guessed it, right there it would be. Now, of course, this could be put down to simple absent-mindedness on my part, but after it happened not only to me but also my fiancé and friends who regularly visit, I'm inclined to believe it's something a bit more. I own a Ouija board, just a cheap little thing. I store the board in the living room, currently on the bookshelf and the planchette in my kitchen with my other witchy bits. It would frequently fall off the bookshelf or the fireplace or the TV shelf, regardless of how it was placed. And of course I have no logical explanation for this. One night after my fiancé had moved in, our daughter was at her dad's for the weekend, and my mum was over for dinner and we did a seance. My mum and I have conducted and practiced in many seances over the years, so we're not just kids messing about, and I can't stress this enough. We were slow to start, the energy was low, but we soon had something come through, but it was sluggish and easily confused. It was finally able to tell us that it was not alone and that something was stopping it from communicating with us. Whatever was stopping it came through stronger and started asking us to lend it our souls. Nope. After a while, without much contact, we closed the seance and saged the crap out of the flat just to be safe. And at first it seemed to have worked, until a few weeks ago when lockdown started. Our little girl frequently gets in bed with us. She's 3, and we co-slept until we moved in here when she was nearly 2. We have times where she spends most of the night in her bed, but since lockdown began, she wakes up at least 2 to 3 times a night, gets in bed with us, as her room is right next door, and there's a light from the bathroom so that it's not too dark, and she's never had a problem walking from her room to ours, often without us even realizing she's gone into bed with us. The bedroom doors do not slam, the carpet is too thick at the bottom, and they're fire doors with a chain that causes them to close slowly. We've tried to slam the door to our bedroom. It doesn't slam. This is important. Another important tidbit. My fiancée sleeps like they're dead. She never wakes up to our daughter at night. But a couple of weeks into the lockdown, my fiancé woke up to our daughter crying, and what sounded like a little person's footsteps on the laminate flooring in the hall, but wasn't fully awake until our bedroom door slammed. She got out of bed to see where she had gone, and she was in the room, as far away from the bedroom door as she could possibly be. When Little saw my fiancée, she shouted that she wanted Mummy, and ran straight past her and straight to our room, into bed with me. She's had no history of sleepwalking. The next morning we spoke about what had happened. I had very uncharacteristically slept through the whole thing, up to Little getting into bed with me. This is important to note, as I always wake up every night, and I wasn't especially tired. There's no reason for me not to have woken up like normal, and yet I slept through it. We came to the conclusion that firstly, the door should not have slammed, particularly if my little one had pushed it slightly open to get into bed with us. Secondly, why did she run out of the room instead of just getting into bed with us as usual? And thirdly, why was she cowering in the corner of her bedroom? Another important tidbit, our daughter and my fiancé have a wonderful relationship and has zero reason to fear either of us. She's never reprimanded for getting into bed with us or waking up with us. Now this is creepy, but it gets spookier. Later that day, we were all sitting in the living room, and our daughter's phone, used for Paw Patrol and kids puzzles, that was on the fireplace, fell rather violently without rhyme or reason. We were all sitting down. Daughter wasn't jumping about. Our neighbors weren't banging on the walls, and there was no reason for her phone to have fallen. There have been times where the living room, which stays open when pushed all the way, has randomly slammed with no breeze or anything that might have caused it to close. And then our little one woke up. I went in to soothe her back to sleep. She had kicked her covers off, so I pulled them back over her. Then she woke up again talking about a monster under the bed and asking me if she was safe in her bed. She had a mid-sleeper, so there's space under her bed, but she'd never worried about monsters being under there before. I wanted to share our story and maybe gain some outside perspective on it, and I'll keep anyone updated on what else happens. But I cleansed the flat today, and I'm really hoping it does the trick. I was in an antique store in the Midwest United States. The buildings are narrow in downtown, and you enter the store on the first floor. I walked to the back, then downstairs, and back to the front of the building. But there was no exit, so you have just backtracked up to the first floor and out the front. The access to the second floor must have been restricted from the public or something. I walk in and there's no one there that I can see ahead of me. I make it back down, then proceed downstairs. I've been to this store several times, so I'm aware there's a TV at the base of the stairs that plays VHS movies. It's quiet for a while, aside from the audio from the TV, which I can plainly hear and discern. Rather suddenly I hear a lady in some distress, presumably on the phone, because there wasn't anyone responding to her. Why can't you understand? I can't go on like this. Why do I deserve any of this? She's manic. This is all happening over the low volume of the TV. I felt a little uncomfortable and considered leaving. She stopped talking, so I resolved to just walk past her. She must have been about 10 feet on the left, in the next booth or two. Absolutely expecting to see a crying woman, I was confused after getting to the dead-end basement, where it felt like I walked in front of an AC window unit, and the hairs on my arms stood on end. I didn't have time to be spooked or scared. None of it made sense. It was just very confusing. I called the owner today. She never experienced anything like this, but several other people have. She listened intently to my story and said she was very sensitive to spirits, and thanked me for telling her about it. I was driving near Las Vegas at around 3 a.m. I had been following a few black SUVs along the highway for a good hour or so. They had Nevada plates that were single-digit numbers in order, 1, 2, 3. Suddenly they all pulled off the highway down a dirt path. There was no mile marker or cactus that would indicate a path there. It was just dirt. After pulling off the road, they all turned their headlights off. I didn't stick around to find out what was going down. It was creepy. The rabbits near where I live all get something that we call mixie or myxomatosis. It's where they go deaf and blind and just wander onto the roads to promptly get killed. We did a sponsored walk with my school at the time, and it happened. We all walked along this long road that was stained red with blood for miles and strewn with literally hundreds, maybe thousands of pulverized rabbits. Nobody said a word the entire time, and all that you could hear were the sobs of younger kids, except for that one moment where it turned to them shrieking. 2 live infected rabbits had basically exploded under a passing car. It was pretty bleak and yet memorable stuff. Sometime during late autumn, a long time ago, my dad's buddy was driving to work early in the morning. It was very early and almost pitch black. He drove through a small forest as usual. When he turned a corner, he saw a corpse hanging off a tree right above the road. Some guy decided to off himself, and this poor factory worker was the one who found him first, alone in the dark, hanging 1 to 2 meters off the ground, illuminated only by the headlights of the car. Needless to say, he called the cops and went home ASAP. He had to go to therapy to overcome how traumatic that event was. In South Africa, we have a lot of hijacking, and for a while, the favored method to stop cars was to play dead in the road. Of course, it doesn't take long for people to figure out that stopping to help people on the road is a bad idea. And that is where my friend of a friend joins the story. On his way home from work one night, he lived on a small holding. He sees a body in the road about 1 kilometer from his house. He quickly realized what was up and decided to just drive up onto the pavement and go around the body without stopping. He got home about 2 minutes later, ran inside and called the police when he saw them coming down the road. He returned to where he had seen the body to tell them where they start their search. Obviously there was no body, but what they did find was quite surprising. 3 dead hijackers hiding in the long grass on the curb. As it turns out, when he had driven up on the curb to avoid the dead guy, he had crushed all of the accomplices. The quote-unquote dead guy was never found, as far as I know. This happened to my girlfriend last night. We had been camping for 4 days, and were leaving on the 5th, but my girlfriend had to leave the night before because of work. I told her to drive safe because I was pretty worried about her hitting a deer. She drives a little Volkswagen Bug, so I knew if she'd hit something it wouldn't go over too well. Around 45 minutes later, she shot me a call and told me about something that happened to her while she was driving. She was driving down a straight stretch of road with no side roads going off it, just forest. While she was driving, she saw headlights pop up behind her, which was odd enough since there were no roads for it to turn off of. Even more odd, the headlights drove up to 60 miles an hour and caught her in around 4 seconds. She said she was listening to a song that had a countdown, so that's how she could tell. Now she was a little sketched out, so she sped up a bit, but it kept following. The headlights pulled up next to her, but she said she didn't see a car, but a silhouette of someone running. She slammed on her brakes and went down to around 20, where the headlights followed the road for a bit before veering off the road into the forest. When she sped back up to that part of the woods, she didn't see any light or anything. Now this really freaked her out, to the point she wanted to stop talking about it, but said her dad had experienced something similar and said it could be a skinwalker. I've never really believed in that kind of thing, so what could explain her experience? And if it could have been something like a skinwalker or a spirit, why did it pretend to be a car?